A very good morning, everyone. Now, if you're looking for the biggest test of electoral opinion since 2019 and the biggest test before the next UK general election, look no further. We have a bumper crop of results coming in over the next 48 hours or so from England, Wales and Scotland. Now, last year's local elections were cancelled because of the pandemic, so this year we're looking at a record number of results from every part of Britain.
This is a key national electoral test here in Scotland and in Wales. Members of the Scottish Parliament and Welsh Senedd are being chosen along with thousands of local councillors across England. Now, Keir Starmer was elected Labour leader on the promise of being able to rebuild the Red Wall. But 18 months on from the disastrous general election, the overnight results suggest there is little indication of a fight back.
Well, yesterday, the people of Hartlepool in the northeast of England chose a new Member of Parliament in a by-election. And for the first time since the 1960s, they chose a Conservative. In fact, it was a thumping win for the Conservative Party by nearly 7,000 votes, a 16% swing, and a heavy blow to Labour's hopes of revival in the northeast of England. The Conservatives said it was because Boris Johnson had delivered on Brexit, while Labour said it underlined the need for the party to change even more to win back its former supporters.
But here in Scotland, the very future of the UK is at stake. Will the SNP, either with or without other pro-independence parties, be able to claim a mandate for a second independence referendum, one that Boris Johnson insists he will oppose? Well, from the BBC's headquarters at Pacific Quay in Glasgow, David Wallace Lockhart will be analysing the most important Scottish election since devolution.
I'll be following the Scottish results as they come in and keeping track of which of these leaders keep smiling as the counting goes on. They'll be glued to this constituency map of Scotland. Now, this was how the results looked after the 2016 election, but that doesn't matter anymore. The 2021 polls are closed, and what's important is how these constituencies and the regional list seats now fill up.
And we'll be in Cardiff for the results of the Senedd elections, the Welsh Parliament, to see if Labour in Wales will hold off the challenge of the Conservatives and Plaid Cymru and keep hold on power yet again. And we'll be keeping track of a dozen battles to be mayor of some of England's biggest cities, including London. Laura Kuenssberg, our political editor, is here to keep an eye on the political reaction and to give her analysis. And Rita's with me once again in the election studio to bring us the results as they come in.
We've already had a swathe of results in from the English council elections. One of the most eye-catching is this. Harlow in Essex is a Conservative gain from Labour. I'll be using the giant touchscreen to look at the figures behind the results in all 7 of the elections taking place across Britain.
Our correspondents are in all the places that matter across England, Wales and Scotland. And our knight with the numbers, Sir John Curtice, will provide the sharpest analysis of the emerging electoral landscape.
And as we've said, a few results already in. They're more than interesting, but there are lots and lots to come. So settle down, join us for all the excitement of this year's election results on the BBC. Yes, welcome everyone. Kirsty and I are your joint hosts today. We're both looking forward to a busy day, to put it mildly, and we're trying to make sense of what's going on. Kirsty, what are you looking for today?
Well, there may be early smiles on the Conservative faces in England after the Hartlepool by-election, but there may be a very big headache in Scotland. Because we will probably know today the extent of how well the SNP has done here in Scotland, taking their main target seats. So, you know, there's 3 early seats, Dumbarton, Edinburgh Central, Ayr. If they take those, they're pretty well on their way to securing a pretty decent majority, either on their own or with the Greens. And that means that Boris Johnson is going to be rejecting their call for a new independence referendum.
OK, Kirsty, and just for you to know roughly what the timetable is, Welsh and Scottish results coming in a bit later. But as I said, we've had a few in already, including the Hartlepool by-election. We will look at the figures in detail with Rita in just a moment. But let's pause and catch up with with the news with Ben.
Good morning. Here is a summary of the BBC News this morning. The Conservatives have taken the parliamentary seat of Hartlepool in what is being described by Labour as a shattering result. The new MP is Jill Mortimer, who is the first Tory in 56 years to represent the former Labour stronghold. Our political correspondent Jonathan Blake has this report.
I do hereby declare that Gillian Wendy Mortimer, commonly known as Jill Mortimer, is duly elected. Congratulations, Jill.
The moment of victory. A Conservative MP elected in a former Labour stronghold. The winning candidate, elected by some margin, said she was proud to break Labour's long run here and argued it was proof her opponents had lost touch.
Labour have taken people in Hartlepool for granted for too long. I heard this time and time again on the doorstep. People have had enough. And now, through this result, the people have spoken and they've made it clear it's time for change.
The Conservatives called it an historic result. 18 months on from their demolition of what was the Red Wall, another patch on the map has turned blue. A blow-up Boris Johnson appeared in Hartlepool to mark the Tories' expected victory, proving the Prime Minister can command support post-Brexit and leaving Labour promising to listen and learn.
For me as a Labour Party member, absolutely shattering to see a Conservative MP elected in a place like Hartlepool after nearly 50 years. And I think what this shows is that although we have started to change since the cataclysm of the last general election, that change has clearly not gone far enough in order to win back the trust of the voters. And we've just seen that in spades, haven't we, in Hartlepool?
Something else for Conservatives to celebrate. The party took control of Nuneaton and Bedworth Council in Warwickshire, one of 143 being contested across England.
People respect what the Prime Minister has done during this pandemic. They think the vaccine rollout is phenomenal, and they think that given all the challenges that we've faced, that the Conservative government, the Prime Minister, has done a really good job in difficult circumstances, and many of those people on the doorsteps have been right behind him.
In Essex, another win for the Conservatives, taking Harlow Council from Labour. The race to count votes early here in Northumberland ended with a Conservative win too, as contests continue for counties, boroughs, districts and more. Labour have held on to several councils in the North East, including Newcastle and Gateshead, but saw their stronghold in Sunderland eroded by the Tories. In London, Labour's Sadiq Khan is seeking a second term, one of 13 city and regional mayors to be elected. Doncaster elected a Labour mayor overnight. Ballot boxes have been gathered from all corners of Scotland, where the SNP are hoping to secure a majority in the Scottish Parliament. And in Wales, Labour will continue their run in power as votes are now counted for the 60 seats in the Senedd. From elections held in the shadow of a pandemic, a renewed political picture is slowly emerging. Jonathan Blake, BBC News.
So, as we've just heard, counting in the Scottish parliamentary election has just begun. Voters were choosing 129 MSPs to be elected to the Scottish Parliament. But COVID restrictions meant there was no overnight vote counting this year. The final results are expected on Saturday. And counting has also begun in the last few minutes in the Welsh elections to the Senedd. 60 seats are up for grabs and some voters reported queues outside polling stations. Most results are expected this afternoon and into the early evening. Results in 4 Wales Police and Crime Commissioner elections are due on Sunday. We will find out today how international travel will restart for England. The Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps, will give a press conference later to announce how the government will open it up. Holidays abroad are currently banned, but a traffic light system of rules will take effect on the 17th of May, with countries classed as green, amber or red. Well, travellers to green countries will not need to quarantine on their return, but they will need to take a COVID test before going and coming back. Arrivals from amber countries will need to quarantine at home on return to the UK, and as well as taking the same tests before departure and return. Red list countries have the strictest rules. Only UK and Ireland residents will be able to come in from those countries, and travellers will have to quarantine for 10 nights in a government-approved hotel at their own expense, in addition to the testing regime. And we will have full coverage of that press conference with Grant Shapps, the Transport Secretary. That's this evening at 5 p.m. on the BBC News Channel. The Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation is expected to recommend that people aged under 40 should be offered an alternative vaccine to the AstraZeneca jab after concerns were raised about blood clots. The policy currently applies to those under 30, but the age threshold could be raised as a precautionary measure. Now, the election results will keep coming in over the next few days, and you can find out the latest results where you live by entering your postcode into our search tool on our website or the BBC News app. So now let's go back to elections 2021.
Yes, welcome back. And we're going to start right away by looking at that result in the Hartlepool by-election, because that's the crucial thing for us to talk about early on. It came in the last couple of hours or so with Jill Mortimer, the first female MP for Hartlepool and the first Conservative since 1974, when the seat was put into its current form. It was called the Hartlepools before that, and most of that time, since 1945, it was Labour. So let's talk to Reeta and ask to go through these figures in detail.
Well, Huw, this is what we're waking up to, isn't it? Hartlepool has gone Conservative after, as you said, decades and decades of it being Labour. The Conservatives had been confident of taking Hartlepool, but we shouldn't let that expectation overshadow their achievement. Jill Mortimer now with a thumping majority of nearly 7,000. How did she do it? Let's take a look at some of the figures behind that result. So Jill Mortimer for the Conservatives got over half of the vote in Hartlepool. Paul Williams for Labour came in on 29%. What's always so interesting in these situations is to look at how the share of the vote has changed, and look at that. The Conservatives have put on 23% compared to last time this seat was up. Now you'll see the Reform Party, which is the Brexit party as was, their vote has plummeted, and clearly that has gone pretty much to the benefit of the Conservatives. But what's interesting to look at here is that the Labour vote is down by 9%. That suggests that it's not simply because of the Reform Party vote going to the Conservatives, but it suggests that the Labour Party has gone back on the sort of support that it had in 2019. Let's just take a look then at the swing from Labour to Conservatives. That is a massive 16% swing. Just take a little look at the EU referendum result there. It was 70% Leave, so a very, very Leavey area, and that clearly has been a factor, a big factor in this result, but there's probably even more to it than that. Huw.
Reeta, many thanks, and we'll be discussing some of that with Laura Kuenssberg in just a moment.
But now we can go straight to our political correspondent, Chris Mason, who is in Hartlepool. Chris Mason, so much to unpack there. Shattering defeat for Labour. And an MP who is not actually of the area, Jill Mortimer, but fought on local issues.
Yeah, that's right. Good morning to you, Kirsty. It's an extraordinary result to try and unpick, looking underneath, if you like, some of those numbers that Reeta was talking through there. Yeah, Jill Mortimer, the new MP, a councillor in North Yorkshire prior to her victory a couple of hours ago here. So yeah, this is a seat that has had a Labour MP ever since it was constituted back in 1974. Has had a Labour MP going back to 1964, as he was saying, under its previous title of the Hartlepools. Now, yes, you can take half a step back and look at the result from 2019, see how well the Brexit Party performed, securing 1 in 4 votes then, and argue that perhaps this result isn't that surprising, because without the Brexit Party then perhaps the Conservatives would have won this seat back in 2019. But put that to one side and take a step back, and it's extraordinary, isn't it? Because Hartlepool for so long for more than a generation. One of those seats that on a general election night would barely merit any attention beyond the boundaries of the town itself. Why? Because it was seen as a rock-solid Labour seat that Labour would win yet again, in which, alongside those Conservative seats that you would chalk up as rock-solid Conservative seats that they would win at any given election. And yet this seat now, falling in with a good number of those seats described as the red wall at the last general election that Boris Johnson was able to bulldoze through. And so an indicator of the reconstituting, the remoulding of English politics, where the Conservatives are able to win and win big, as the numbers show, in seats that for so long were regarded as guaranteed Labour territory.
And of course, the recrimination have begun already, because Jeremy Corbyn won 50% of the vote here in 2017. We've had Diane Abbott out the traps saying the strategy was wrong. We've had Caroline Flint out the traps saying it was wrong to focus on the curtains. You should have been focusing on a new Labour strategy, and that was absent. And this is a constituency which Keir Starmer and Boris Johnson each visited 3 times. Keir Starmer to absolutely no avail.
Yeah, quite. I mean, both party leaders were here regularly, which gave you some sense during the campaign of the jeopardy around this contest. And as you say, yes, the recriminations undoubtedly beginning within the Labour movement. So the Labour leadership are acknowledging openly how wounding this defeat is, talking about their need to redouble their efforts to try and re-secure the trust of voters in places like Hartlepool. If the word re-treble existed, it would be worth them using it, given the scale of the challenge that they face. And then the argument more broadly within Labour about, as you say, their strategy. Now, there are some on the left of the party, those loyal to Jeremy Corbyn, who've been itching to be able to criticise Keir Starmer, will be able to use this result as evidence for their case that he isn't sufficiently changing the party, given that they can point to the fact that Jeremy Corbyn did win here in Hartlepool, both in 2019 and in 2017. For Sir Keir Starmer, the psychological damage of this defeat is that, yes, he's long argued since he became leader a year ago that there was a huge mountain to climb, as he describes it, for Labour in order to win the next general election. But there was the hope within the leader's office that they had hit rock bottom, the Labour Party, at the last general election, that performance in 2019, the worst general election performance for Labour since 1935, was the seabed, that the only way was up from there. Now, of course, over the course of the weekend, there are plenty more results to come. And mathematically, of course, one by-election result doesn't really change the numbers at Westminster particularly significantly. But it will change the mood, because it'll mean that the Conservatives can be buoyant as far as their Westminster prospects look, and Labour face big questions, with the fear that there's plenty of other seats like this where Labour MPs this morning will be thinking, blimey, will I be safe at the next general election? And they'll be fearful that the answer to that is no.
Chris, thanks a lot.
So let's just underline, we've had that one parliamentary by-election, which we can talk about in a second with Laura. We're expecting the Scottish Parliament results, the Welsh Senedd, the Welsh Parliament results, local authority results right across England, 143 councils, 4,500 seats up for grabs there, plus city and regional mayors, plus police and crime commissioners. Honestly, the list goes on. But the great thing about all of this is it's a brilliant test. It's a fantastic test of public opinion before the next election comes along. And when I spoke about English local authorities, this will underline for you the challenge for Labour. We've already seen Hartlepool, where they took a very heavy blow. But we look at these councils, Harlow in Essex, for example. The Conservatives have gained that from Labour. In Northumberland, in the northeast, where we saw Chris there just now, the Conservatives have gained control of Northumberland from no overall control. They've done the same in Nuneaton and Bedworth in the Midlands. They've done the same in Dudley, very important battleground in the Midlands. So these local authorities are very telling signals, really. Look at Dudley there, if you look at the figures, 46 seats to 24 for Labour and 2 for the Independents. Look at the difference between this and last time, because you'll see that the Conservatives have gained 12 seats, Labour down 11. So can we just look at those figures for a second, we will see a pattern in lots of these seats where a big UKIP or Brexit party vote will be seen to, as we expected, seen to go back, if you like, into the Conservative fold, as lots of people expect. But there, it didn't happen. It was from Labour to the Conservatives. So Harlow is a gain for the Conservatives from Labour. Nuneaton and Northumberland and Dudley, Conservative gains, but from no overall control. They're just the first 4 we have, but they're very significant. And clearly, if you're a Labour supporter, you'll be looking at that with some trepidation before lots of these other results come in. Right, let's bring Laura in. Can we start with the by-election in Hartlepool, Laura, because the figures speak for themselves. It's a 16% swing. What's the analysis here? Is that a Brexit thing? Is it a COVID vaccine rollout thing? Is it more a local thing? What's your take?
I think there's a mixture of all different factors. You know, we can never get into the minds of individual voters in the ballot box with a pencil hovering over their piece of paper. But let's just maybe take those in turn. First of all, I think COVID has made this entire set of elections really strange, really unusual. It's been hard for the parties to campaign. It means also that voters, we hear from the doorsteps, have been very preoccupied, quite understandably, with the vaccine programme, with what's going on, with whether or not their job's going to be okay. Are they still on furlough? And looking in particular at the vaccine programme, you think that's been a stunning public policy success for this government that has created a certain amount of feel-good about the government's performance at this stage of the pandemic. So if you take that in one. Second of all, though, when you talk about Brexit, now technically we've seen, and I think in those councils too, and I suspect we'll keep seeing, as voters who went from Labour to UKIP to the Brexit Party, not going back to Labour, going instead to the Tories. And that is clearly something that has been going on. But I don't think that Brexit has been playing hugely on the doorsteps in terms of voters' minds. But I think Brexit was both a sort of a proxy for a change that was already happening, shifts that were already happening in the undergrowth in terms of how voters feel about the two big main Westminster parties. That clearly has been an issue.
OK, let's think about the position for Labour. A relatively new leader, Keir Starmer, there for about a year, hasn't he? And what would be the thinking in that leader's office today? Yes, it's early stages, but clearly the by-election speaks for itself in an area that is important to Labour, if it ever wants to gain power again. What would be the thinking there about the reasoning? Is this a kind of overhang from what Labour's been through in the last few years? Or is this a more permanent shift to a party which has delivered Brexit and which is seen to be more in tune, if you like, with people?
I think the hope is that this is a sort of backblast, perhaps the bottom of the kind of end result of everything that's happened in the last 5 years in British politics. You know, whether it's Brexit or Boris Johnson's reputation confirmed again as being a vote winner, or whether indeed it's the damage that they believe was done by Jeremy Corbyn's stewardship of the party. The fear is that this is actually something that is much more permanent, that therefore is harder for them to peel back. They are already facing criticism publicly, as you'd expect, from the left of the party, the former Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell, saying that the candidate in Hartlepool had no argument, he was naked. The campaigning group Momentum that backed Jeremy Corbyn already saying this is a disaster and there has to be a change of tack. I think the leader's office, however, is going to go the other way. I think they are more aggressively going to use this to make the case for change and sticking to the centre, rather than perhaps trying to accommodate the left, as Keir Starmer did in his leadership campaign to win the party. He was all about party unity. I think actually the leader's office in the next few days is going to be more aggressive in making that case for change. But change to what? And even his allies, Keir Starmer, would privately admit they haven't yet done a great job of articulating precisely and compellingly what the reason is for putting a cross in the box for Labour again.
We already have a few illustrations, Laura, of what people are saying. Look at this quote from the senior Labour MP, Diane Abbott. It's just come in on social media. And Diane Abbott says this: a crushing defeat for Labour in Hartlepool. Not possible to blame Jeremy Corbyn for this result. Labour won the seat twice under his leadership. Keir Starmer must think again about his strategy. Let's just hang on, because people's momentum, the momentum movement, have also been saying this about Hartlepool again. This result is a disaster. In 2017, we won over 50% of the vote in Hartlepool. A transformative socialist message has won in Hartlepool before, and it would have won again. So they wasted no time in coming out to say, hang on a second, the problem here is not that, Mr Corbyn was a problem, it's the fact that you've moved away from it. Straight out of the traps.
But what's also worth remembering is that in the 2019 election, more than 10,000 people in Hartlepool voted for the Brexit Party. Now, clearly, Keir Starmer has not given them reason to go back to Labour if they were ever there. But I think the leader's office are not going to think, oh, this is a time to move back to the left. And you have to suggest, and I think people on the right, we've heard surprisingly not from Lord Mandelson already this morning, that actually what the party has to do is talk about aspiration again. They have to be on the centre ground. Going to the left doesn't succeed from them. And there's a valid question there to ask. What is it about people moving to the Tory party that suggests that they want a more left-wing Labour Party? Is there really a logic there? But I do think we can expect some days of strife for the Labour leader. One former member of the NEC, the party's ruling body, has actually told me this morning that Keir Starmer should go. Now, I don't think that the leader's office are expecting kind of dramatic things and real tension that could actually end up in anything as significant as that. But there's no question they have to come out punching here. They clearly haven't been able to land their arguments in the way that they would hope, and there's going to be mounting pressure on him to do so in the coming days.
Thanks, Laura. I'm just going to pause there because we're being joined by the Labour MP Alison McGovern, who's in the Wirral Shadow Minister. Alison, good morning. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, nice to speak to you, Huw.
Can I pick up on Laura's point there, Alison? Basically, that you're just not landing your points with former voters of yours in a seat like Hartlepool, and just wondering really what your reading of that is. What went wrong here?
Well, as everybody's been saying, we've been having a difficult time. We've had a very bad result in 2019. I think it's really important that we focus on where the country is now, whether it is the situation for all our kids, whether they're in Hartlepool or anywhere else in the country, who have really struggled through lockdown, and making sure that we have got a really good education system. Those are the kinds of issues where I think we need to focus, make sure that we've got practical deliverable policies, and that we are able to talk to people about why voting Labour is the answer. Because I know that there's lots of people who will have voted Conservative with a heavy heart, who want there to be an alternative. And I think the way to do that is to offer people a practical set of policies that give them hope for the future, that we don't live in a one-party, Tory state, that actually things can be better and different in the future.
I'm assuming that, your colleagues, you and your colleagues were making those points in Hartlepool. You were talking about those issues. So the question obviously is, were people receptive to that message, or what were they telling you about reasons they did not want to vote for you?
Well, it's kind of a statement of the obvious that we didn't do well enough, and obviously that's not good. But I suppose the question is, what engages people in politics? I think there's a lot of people who are turned off too often by politics, but I think the right thing to do is to focus on the practical needs of the country and to be ambitious for our future. We've had a terrible year with COVID. It's been really, really challenging and difficult. But we know that what will give people hope is building on the best of our country, whether that's, all of their NHS and public servants who've delivered the vaccine programme so brilliantly, or whether that is making sure we're ambitious. Look at the chances and opportunities for children and young people in too many parts of the country that aren't good enough. And actually having practical policies that can deliver on that ambition, I think, is where we should be. I think we'll have a lot of results to come in. Obviously, it's devastating to lose Hartlepool, but really we've got to keep on going, make sure our ambition for the country is clear. And I think that is the way to improve on our results in the future.
But Alison, it's Laura here, isn't it? It's interesting that you say people voted Conservative with a heavy heart. That's something quite familiar that Labour politicians often say, but isn't actually the problem that you're not trying to understand that people wanted to vote Conservative? You're suggesting people voted Conservative regretfully. Don't you actually have to understand that people willingly did so, and many voters in Hartlepool might have been only too glad to vote Tory? It's like you don't want to understand that people have made this choice.
Well, as you know, I've stood in a Labour-Tory swing marginal seat in a general election 4 times, so I don't think it would be a good characterisation of my my position to say, you know, I don't understand the reasons why people might vote Conservative. I do. I talk to people and listen to them and their priorities all the time. I suppose what I'm saying is, if people, there are plenty of people, I think, who will have voted Conservative, but nonetheless want there to be an option for the future, want there to be change. And I think that the Labour Party has a lot to say on that. The question for us is, how do we make sure that we get heard? How do we make sure that our ideas are communicated in a positive and practical way, and that we are able to bring people with us, which quite clearly in the case of Hartlepool we haven't done. So yes, we have to ask ourselves that question. I think, you know, everybody understands the need for change, and that is where our focus should be.
Alison McGovern, it's Kirsty Wark here in Edinburgh, just coming in here. A couple of points on this. This was a 70% Leave seat. You had a Remain Labour MP. You yourself were part of the People's Vote campaign that wanted a second referendum. The problem was you were out of touch with what people in Hartlepool wanted. They backed Brexit, and they now want jobs for Hartlepool. They want new homes for Hartlepool. They want new businesses in Hartlepool. And that was what the Conservatives were offering, a levelling up agenda. And as Laura said, they wanted that. They backed that.
Right, and the Conservatives will be judged on what they deliver. And as I've already mentioned, you know, in the case of jobs for young people, we've got this pathetic Kickstart programme that actually has delivered very few jobs for young people. So that ambition is right. And look, Brexit is done now. The question is, what happens to our economy?
Alison,
you know,
we're just watching your party leader, Sir Keir Starmer, just leaving home in North London. And sorry to interrupt you, but okay. I don't think there were any words there for the waiting reporters. But Mr Starmer there, just Sir Keir, just leaving home. I'm sure we'll be hearing from him a little later. Alison, just on that then, given that we've seen Sir Keir there, what will be his message, do you think, or what should be his message to those people who are dismayed within the party today?
We are on a journey and we've got to keep going. You know, we know that we need to win people's votes back. We'll need to win Hartlepool. We need to win in lots of places in Scotland, in North Wales. So we are on this journey and we have to keep going. You know, we have to be really ambitious for the country, but at the same time, make sure that our policies are practical and deliverable.
Alison McGovern, good of you to join us, and thank you very much.
And now we can go to Ben Brown with the news.
Kirsty, thank you very much. Good morning. Here's a summary of the BBC News. The Conservatives have taken the parliamentary seat of Hartlepool with a resounding majority of almost 7,000. The new MP is Jill Mortimer, who's the first Tory in 56 years to represent the former Labour stronghold. Labour has described the by-election result as shattering. The Tories have also made gains across local councils. They have taken control of 4 councils, gaining 57 seats, compared to Labour losses of 60 seats. 17 local authorities have declared their results, but there are 126 which are still counting votes. Counting in the Scottish parliamentary election began half an hour ago. Voters were choosing 129 MSPs to be elected to the Scottish Parliament, but COVID restrictions meant there was no overnight vote counting this year. The final results are expected on Saturday. Counting's also begun in the Welsh elections to the Senedd. 60 seats are up for grabs and some voters reported queues outside polling stations. Most results are expected this afternoon and into the early evening. The results of 4 Wales Police and Crime Commissioners elections are due on Sunday. Meanwhile, the first result in the regional mayoral elections has been announced. Labour's Ros Jones has secured a third term as Doncaster's mayor, with a majority of over 10,000 votes still being counted for the 12 other directly elected mayors, but results are not expected until the weekend. Now, we will find out today how international travel will restart for England. The Transport Secretary Grant Shapps will give a press conference later on today to announce how the government will open up travel. Holidays abroad are currently banned, but a traffic light system of rules will take effect on the 17th of May, with countries classed as either green, amber or red. Well, Julia Lo-Boué-Said is Chief Executive of the Advantage Travel Partnership, an association of independent travel agents and involved in the government's Global Travel Task Force. And she joins us now. Thanks for being with us. What are you expecting to hear today from the Transport Secretary?
Good morning. The first thing we're looking to hear is that the ban on international travel will be lifted, as you said, from the 17th of May. And in place, we'll have the traffic light framework, which has already been described and set out in the Global Travel Task Force, which really gives consumers and travellers the ability to understand short term, but obviously working through towards the summer, where the countries they're looking to travel to will be sitting.
And in the short term, which countries do you expect to be on the green list? Because there's been a lot of speculation about that. What's your money on?
I'm not a gambler, unfortunately, so I won't be speculating. And it's a really difficult one because there is a huge amount, as you say, speculation. But actually, what's really important is how customers end up booking. So how you book is almost arguably more important to which countries will be sitting on that list. How you book and when you book is going to be really crucial, and making sure that when you are booking flexible options, because there will be changes inevitably throughout the summer. Countries will move through the list. So really being very careful about who you book with and how you book is critically important.
Yeah, just to underline, because the countries that are announced today on the various lists, that will be reviewed in June and July. So what about the prices, though? A lot of reports in today's newspapers that actually prices are already rocketing up for countries that are potentially on the green list.
I think that's the problem you have with speculation. I think it unfortunately creates different behaviours. But I have to be honest, we're not seeing that yet. I think, supply and demand will start to determine what the price point will be. It's not something we're seeing yet. And certainly through our members, what they're trying to do is make sure that they have available all the different options, and as and when traffic light settings do become available and we are clear in which countries are available, they can advise their customers on the best options for them, and make sure they have access to flexible options in case of changes that may occur.
So we're going to get the list today. So your advice to people is maybe just hold tight for a day or so before rushing into book?
My advice is don't listen to speculation. Wait for a formal list to be advised. Think about, if you are thinking to travel for travelling this summer, please think about who you book with. Book through a human travel agent. They are best placed to guide you and really hold your hand through the process. A lot of travellers haven't travelled post-Brexit either, so travelling is going to be a different experience to what you experienced before. But almost as important, and we forget about this, travel agents can advise the experience in resort, which arguably that's the end game, is what we're all waiting for. So think about who you book, how you book through a human travel agent who can really help you understand what the best options are for you. OK, good advice. Thank you very much indeed for being with us, Julia Lo-Boué-Said, who is Chief Executive of the Advantage Travel Partnership. And we will have full coverage of that press conference with the Transport Secretary Grant Shapps this evening. That's at 5 o'clock on the BBC News channel. The Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation is expected to recommend that people under the age of 40 should be offered an alternative vaccine to the Oxford AstraZeneca jab after concerns were raised about possible blood clots. Well, the policy currently applies to those under the age of 30, but the age threshold could be raised as a precautionary measure. Police searching for the murderer of Police Community Support Officer Julia James have said they will not rest until the killer is found. A £10,000 reward is being offered for information about the murder. Officers have yet to establish what weapon was used and have not been able to identify any suspects or establish a motive. Well, we'll be back with Elections 2021 in just a moment. First, let's take a look at the latest weather forecast for you. That's with Carol Kirkwood.
Hello again. For many of us, it was a chilly start to the day, but also a dry one and a bright one with just a few showers. We'll see further showers develop through the course of the day, though, and again, some of those will be heavy, particularly in eastern areas, with the potential for some hail and some thunder. And at the same time, cloud will thicken across the southwest, heralding the arrival of an area of low pressure later on. Temperatures 7 to about 15 as we push further south. Now, through this evening, under clear skies, temperatures will fall away quite quickly. And as this system comes in from the southwest, it will not only bring rain and gusty winds, it will also bring some milder air with it. Except for across northern England and Scotland, you will still have relatively clear skies. So in rural areas, you're prone to a touch of frost. So through tomorrow, here is that Atlantic low with all its weather fronts around it, producing some heavy rain at times, especially in the west, and windy conditions, but not the temperatures rising. Still unsettled on Sunday, but higher temperatures by then.
Welcome back now to our bumper election programme with myself and Huw. We can go straight round the country now in Scotland and look at what's happening in some of the key counts. Picking up now, we're going to be seeing pictures from some of the counts. There we have Livingston. We're expecting Livingston. That result will be sometime this afternoon. They started working hard at 9 a.m. and you can see a very packed hall there in Livingston. And then actually, we're going to go quite to a different place in the country now. We're going to move on from Livingston and we're going to go straight over to the Orkney Isles, a quieter area there, but they are expecting Orkney to deliver a result at roughly 3 o'clock this afternoon. So they're dealing obviously with both constituency results and list results. And as you know, the Orkney Isles are very spread out, so it'll take a while for them to get going as they bring those results in, because of course with no overnight counting, some of those results were only delivered to the counting station at 9 o'clock this morning. And then finally we can go on to Aberdeen. Again, this is a key result, and that will be a result. These results from Aberdeen will be delivered tonight, they expect, by 6 o'clock. So Aberdeen, in a big area, we're expecting big news from Aberdeen West, because that is a key target for the SNP, and we're going to get that this afternoon. But I'm joined now by our political correspondent, Nick Eardley. Nick, first of all, intel from the polling station, certainly last night, I was hearing from friends texting me that at 10 o'clock there were queues in Ayr, there were queues in Balerno, there were queues in Glasgow.
Yeah, despite the weather and despite the pandemic, all the parties seem to think that turnout is pretty strong. In terms of how they're all doing individually, big dollop of caution at this stage, of course, because nobody really knows. But the SNP seem in pretty good spirits. They think they've got their 2019 vote out, which matters because at the 2019 election they did very well. They got 48 seats. They won back a bunch of the seats they'd lost in 2017 when their vote didn't turn out. Yeah. So it's going to be a while before we know if they're close to that majority, but at the moment they seem in good spirits. The Greens, the other pro-independence party, seem in even better spirits. I've spoken to a couple of senior Greens who think that they're on course for a record tally in the next Scottish Parliament.
And of course the thing about that is it's that combination that is so important. So what we're looking for today is we're looking for early results from the SNP that would indicate that they're picking up the seats they need, but we're also looking for a strong showing from the Green, because together that is going to be the big headache for Boris Johnson and the Tories. And what are you looking at from the Tories in Scotland?
Well, the Tories' vote has largely focused on the regional list, the second vote, the one that we're probably not going to know until later in the day tomorrow. But the Tories are really confident that that strategy's worked. They think their votes turned out when it comes to the regional list. Labour sounding a bit cautious this morning when it comes to that. But the other thing everybody's talking about is tactical voting from the unionist parties. And when it comes to the constituencies, that could be really important to whether an increased SNP turnout is actually enough in those key swing seats we're seeing today. Edinburgh Central, Ayr, Dumbarton. Tactical voting could play a big role.
Nick, thanks very much. You're back with us later.
Now, do we remember Dominic Cummings, the Prime Minister's former advisor? He's clearly watching. Welcome, Dominic, and thanks for tweeting just in time for us to quote it, because it's rather useful for our debate. And look at this. When pundits who explained why Vote Leave's plan to realign politics was mad, stupid, impossible, now give post hoc explanations for why it's all so logical and inevitable, ignore their babble, says Dominic. Pundits equal noise, not signal. E.g., the centre ground does not exist, he says. It's pundit fiction. Why am I quoting that? Well, apart from the fact that it's interesting coming from Mr. Cummings, who's the former close advisor in Downing Street, it also tells us something about the logic for some analysts as they look at the switch from Labour to Conservative. Why have former Labour voters gone into the Conservative fold. It's a realignment, which Dominic Cummings is alluding to there, the vote leave strategy, if you like, targeting people who might be susceptible or might be vulnerable or might be, in fact, those who can be appealed to in terms of the values that they're going to be switched along to in terms of the Brexit referendum and, of course, in terms of political values more broadly. And that translates into results across England in the local elections. Now, we've already had a few in. So what I'm going to ask Reeta to do, before I chat to Laura again, is to take us through some of those big results and the ones where maybe, Reeta, they changed hands.
Yes, indeed, Huw. So here are some of the most eye-catching results we've had in so far. And as you can see, there are 4 Conservative gains. You can see the flashes at the side, I should just explain, are what they were before. So if they're grey, they were a hung council. If they're red, they were Labour. If they're blue, they were Conservative. So we can see here 4 Conservative gains, 2 Labour holds and 2 Conservative holds. But as Huw was saying, what we can see behind these bold results are a pattern of a shift in support from Labour to Conservative in Leave voting areas. Let me show you in greater detail what's going on in 2 or 3 of these councils. So this is Nuneaton and Bedworth in Warwickshire. This was Conservative in 2008, but hasn't been since then. You can see it's been Labour and hung. The Conservatives have now got a majority of 14 seats. And let's just take a look at the seat change here. You can see it's just been a straight swap. Up 10 for the Conservatives, down 10 for Labour, and this is in an area that voted 66% to leave. Let's take a look at one of the other councils that Huw was talking about a bit earlier. Dudley, a Conservative gain. Now, they had been very confident of putting in a good performance in Dudley, and they've got a majority of 20 seats here. Similarly, a 68% leave vote in Dudley. Conservatives got a Westminster seat in this area in 2019, and look at that, a 12-seat add-on for the Conservatives, Labour losing 11 and UKIP losing 1. When we go back to the list, it's a similar sort of story in Harlow in Essex, which the Conservatives have gained from Labour. And the bad news for Labour is that even in councils that they've hung on to, such as Sunderland, you can see a drop in the Labour vote. So, you know, they've got a majority of 9 seats, quite comfortable. It's been Labour for a long time. But the seat change, you can see, they've gone down by 9 seats, Conservatives up 6, and the Lib Dems up 4. And if we take a look at the change in the share of the vote, so that is the share of the vote, but we can see now the change in the share. Yeah, that's pretty painful for Labour, isn't it? Down 15%, Conservatives up 13%. The Lib Dems doing well as well. So you can see, well, it would suggest that the UKIP vote has gone to the Conservatives and Labour has lost some of it, possibly, to the Liberal Democrats. Always a bit hard to tell how the churn works. I just want to finish by showing you quite where we are. I mean, you know, we've got a lot of election results still to come in, 143 councils in all, 16 of them have declared. So you can see the Conservatives have put on 57 and Labour have lost 60. The Lib Dems have gained 2 and the Greens have gained 3. So that is where we are at the moment.
Well, what I'd like to do now is just to catch up on the state of play in some of these important councils. Let's look at the county of Essex and join my colleague Simon Dedman, who's there. You're in Basildon, Simon. I'm just aware that Basildon is one authority. Harlow is the other authority we've been talking about. So just bring us up to date and tell us what the party officials are telling you there.
Well, I think there is a nervousness from Labour in Basildon of what could happen here could be a repeat of what happened in Harlow. Right now, there are counts underway for what should be 4 safe Labour wards, including the council leaders. The Tories have told me they think they've got a good chance of taking Vange and possibly some of these other wards. If that happens, it's not looking good for Labour, who are in coalition on the council with independents. They have a majority of just one. We did see overnight in Harlow a blue wave move across the borough there. Labour won just one of the 7 seats it was defending. Their council leader gone, the former Labour council leader gone. The Conservatives winning in places that you wouldn't normally expect them to do in Harlow. We talk a lot about the Red Wall in the north, but there were places like Bushfairs which you would not expect to see the Conservatives win there, but they did. However, elsewhere in the county of Essex, it hasn't all been doom and gloom for Labour. Yes, they haven't made great advances, but they haven't made any losses in Thurrock overnight. And in Southend, they did gain 1 seat. But on the county council, they haven't picked up any seats so far. Labour really hoping to win back the 3 seats it lost in 2017 in Harlow County. It failed to do so. The Lib Dems, though, have picked up 2 seats on the county and lost 1. And there's also been some residents' parties who have gained 3 so far. That result we won't know until later on this afternoon, and we won't know the final result here in Basildon until the afternoon as well.
Simon, many thanks.
And now I'm joined by Luke Walton in Stockton, the North East. Stockton itself, no council election there. But let's just talk more broadly about the North East. We know that Northumberland has gone to the Conservatives. Sunderland is a Labour hold, but they have lost 9 seats. Obviously, the big story will probably be the Ben Houchen story in the Tees Valley. But what does this say about the general direction of travel in this area, which returned some of the biggest new Labour beasts? It returned Tony Blair in Sedgefield, Mo Mowlam in Redcar, Peter Mandelson in Hartlepool. What is the change of atmosphere telling you about the North East?
Well, as you say, this was a region which had at one stage half the Labour cabinet, but no longer. And as you say, it really is the Conservatives who are smiling here today. I'm actually here at the count in Stockton, and we're expecting the counting to begin for the Cleveland Police and Crime Commissioner in just a few minutes' time, and then the voting for the Tees Valley Mayor in the afternoon. And the Conservatives are expecting, or at least hoping, for 3 out of 3 after that huge victory in Hartlepool. But as you say, I think there are deeper things at play here. Clearly, this was a Brexit voting region, and there does seem to have been a break, if you like, between many voters and the Labour Party. Specifically, though, when we come down to the contests that are being voted here, Labour has had the Police and Crime Commissioner on Cleveland since 2012, but the Tories are really hopeful that they might be able to flip that blue today. One reason is that the local police force has had a lot of problems, and there was a damning inspection report to Cleveland Police in 2019. A lot of people held the then Labour Commissioner responsible for some of those issues, and the Conservatives are hoping to capitalise that by winning with their candidate Steve Turner for the Commissioner post. You mentioned already the Tees Valley Mayor. Of course, the Conservatives won a surprise victory there in 2017 with Ben Houchen winning a very slender victory, but he seems to have capitalised on that and built a really big profile in this part of the world. He's developed a bit of a reputation as a deal maker. One of his issues was saving the local airport and nationalising it, a controversial policy, but he would say it has worked, and he's actually created new flights and new services there at the airport. But probably even bigger than that, he's brought a free port to Teesside. He's also helped redevelop or develop plans for the redevelopment of the old steelworks there. So I suppose his reputation is a man who can get things done and actually has the inside track with the government, with Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, of course, just down the road at Richmond. Now, Labour would question the substance of some of this and say that many of these promises have not yet been developed, but clearly it is something that has cut through with voters, and I think the evidence of that was the fact that Ben Houchen was very evident out on the campaign trail during the Hartlepool by-election. And privately, the Conservatives expect to win the Tees Valley Mayor by a very large margin today indeed, and perhaps some reflection of the fact that many of the parties didn't even bother putting up candidates against Ben Houchen. Only Labour did, so it's just a two-way battle here. So we're expecting that result later in the afternoon, but as I say, Conservatives looking potentially at winning 3 out of 3 of these contests in this part of the world. They've already turned a situation where there was only one Conservative MP across the Tees Valley back in 2016. Now, with this Hartlepool victory, there are 5 out of 7, so a real transformation.
Simon, thanks so much.
Let's get some more perspectives. Let's talk to Rob Parsons, political editor of the Yorkshire Post in Leeds, and to Helen Pidd, who's North of England editor for The Guardian in Manchester. Rob, can I start with you? How does it look in your region, and what are you expecting to see today?
Hi there, Hugh. So I'd say it's a bit too early to tell whether that result in Hartlepool means that we're going to see similarly dramatic swings across Yorkshire and the north. The only concrete result we've had so far is the election of Doncaster's mayor, Ros Jones, who was re-elected for a third term with a 10,000 majority. But unlike in 2017, when she was last elected, she didn't get 50% of the vote in the first round, and the Conservative challenger got 8,000 more votes this time round. So based on that, you'd expect that in Doncaster, which, like Hartlepool, is a strongly Leave-backing town, Labour may lose a handful of seats to the Conservatives when councillors are elected later today. And across Yorkshire, there's, to be honest, not too many potential bright spots for Labour. They hold nearly all the councils where elections are being held this weekend. So it's more a matter of holding on to what they have as best they can, I think. What's interesting, actually, is that the town halls that they may be most at risk of losing could be Sheffield and Hull, where the Conservatives aren't really a factor and the Liberal Democrats are the main opposition party. So, and I think we've seen this in other parts of the country, but it shows that Labour is potentially being squeezed from both sides.
Just you mentioned Brexit, obviously, there, Rob. I'm just wondering, what is your wider reading of what's happening to that former Labour vote?
Well, I think on the back of Hartlepool, there's going to be a few Labour MPs in their northern heartlands who are going to be feeling a bit nervous, but based on this morning's result, about the prospect of holding on to their slim majorities at the next general election, because Brexit does seem to still be a factor. And if you looking ahead to 2024, Ed Miliband in Doncaster North, he had a majority of 2,400, and the Brexit Party got 8,300 votes in 2019. And so if you consider the way that Brexit Party voters have gone to the Conservatives in Hartlepool, if that kind of swing and sort of traditional Labour voters continuing to desert the party, if that continues, you could see quite a few slender majorities being overhauled in 2024.
Helen, can I just come in here on the first point about the Hartlepool by-election was, as Caroline Flint pointed out this morning in terms of tactical errors, it may not have made a difference, but actually it was Labour's call as to when to hold this by-election. They need not have held it on a day when all the razzmatazz was round Ben Houghton. They could have waited, they could have done it a different day. Would it, do you think, have made a difference?
No, I really don't think so. Not when we're looking at a majority of, was it about 8,000, the majority? I think what we can learn from the Hartlepool by-election is that Labour's tactic of calling the Tories kind of evil sleazebags, it just doesn't work. It hasn't stuck at all. And the fact that former Labour voters either are staying at home or just don't see a positive reason to vote for Labour is a massive problem for the party. So I think, although Ben Houghton is incredibly popular, and I'd be astonished if he's not returned with a bigger majority later on today, I don't think holding on a different day would have made a difference.
Just on what you're saying about positive reasons to vote Labour, is what's happening to Labour in the Red Wall similar, do you think, to what happened to Labour in Scotland with the SNP, where there was not a positive reason people thought to vote Labour when actually the SNP had guns on their territory?
Yeah, I think so. And also, I was thinking this morning about Keir Starmer's first year as Labour leader, and I struggled to think of any policy or any kind of, exciting, eye-catching thing that he said. And I know he's had an incredibly difficult job, but, what is his vision? What does he want to do? And just sort of saying, well, at least I'm not Jeremy Corbyn, it's not good enough, is it?
Thanks very much, Helen.
And Rob, thanks very much to you as well, Rob Parsons in Leeds. Really grateful to you. So let me turn once again to Laura. Some interesting thoughts there with Laura, not least about where Labour goes if this day pans out in the way that it looks at the moment. Let's not take everything for granted, but there are not great signs there for Labour so far. So what kind of response could we expect from Keir Starmer?
Well, I think that his team are likely to try to sort of punch quite hard out of this. This is clearly in the early phases, a really big drubbing for them, no question about that. They are, though, no doubt going to come under pressure from the left. We know the Socialist Campaign Group of MPs, people who were loyal to Jeremy Corbyn, are likely to meet in the next few days to talk about what to do, to put forward their own ideas, maybe to suggest even a sort of federal Labour Party, changing the structures. But I think it's also likely that the top team might be reshuffled. He may well move his front bench around to try to have some kind of feeling of a reset at Westminster. But I think that Keir Starmer's choice will be, I think, to double down, actually, on what he's been trying to do. But as Helen Pidd was suggesting there, his allies know that they have not yet, perhaps for him, managed to distill down what it is he really wants to say. It's one thing talking about historic shifts, it's one thing talking about the terrible travails of the party under Jeremy Corbyn, but it's another to change the conversation to what he would actually want to do. He can't just be not Jeremy Corbyn, he can't just be a critic of Boris Johnson, and there is something of a gap there that they're going to have to try to fill.
We've spent the past few weeks talking, among other things, about allegations of Tory sleaze, of allegations of giving contracts to mates and all the rest of it. It doesn't seem to have had an impact on this basis.
No, it doesn't, and that's something the Conservatives all the way through were sort of saying, well, look, we're sure that nothing has really gone wrong here. Of course, we'll investigate on lots of different things, and there are lots of investigations that have been sort of preoccupying Westminster. But there's been a clear view from the Tory party that this isn't something right now that has been cutting through to voters. It seems as if that calculation has been borne out by these early results. And it's also, I think, for them a vindication of Boris Johnson's reputation at this stage as being a vote winner. And that is why, even though there are plenty of people in the Tory party who don't necessarily have any personal loyalty to Boris Johnson, they don't necessarily back him on every single thing, there are plenty of them who's also been raising their eyebrows about some of the things he's done in office. But at the end of the day, he's there because he's somebody who can win campaigns. And that, time and again, it appears now, has been vindicated, which is the thing that drives his critics absolutely wild. They may not like how he behaves, they may not like his personal style, but time and again, and it appears that this set of elections is confirming that, he's somebody who can turn out punters and actually win votes. And just very briefly, that tweet from Dominic Cummings that you mentioned, there's obviously absolutely gallons of bad blood now between those two men. But it's a reminder that this political strategy was deliberate, because politics is about a choice and it's about seizing opportunities, whether those are demographic changes, economic changes, geographic differences in the political patterns of this country. And we are seeing that strategy at this early stage seems again for Boris Johnson to be bearing a lot of fruit.
Mm-hmm. Laura, can I just bring you to Scotland for a moment and talking about strategy in Scotland? You know, this tactical voting, who is the best party to save the union? You're talking about whether Labour's got a strategy. We haven't heard very much about any kind of Labour strategy to deal with the possibility of an independence referendum. So in fact, in key marginals, it may be that the Conservative vote will go up because tactically, Labour voters see the Tories as the best party to defend the union.
I think that's potentially absolutely right. You know, the Conservatives have been able to prosper to a degree in Scotland in the last few years because they have been the ones who've been able to identify very strongly with the unionist side of the argument. They've been seen as much more relevant in terms of being able to take that fight to the Scottish National Party, because Labour's vote seemed to have just sort of rotted away, and the party really in Scotland was in a sort of battle for relevance. Now, that new leader in Scotland for Scottish Labour, Anna Sarwar, seems to have been able to get some kind of zeitgeist during the campaign. He was suddenly very visible. But certainly in Labour insiders don't believe that they've been able to turn things around very dramatically, if indeed at all. So it is the Conservatives who've been able to be really the most prominent on the unionist side of the debate, even though when you think of their overall political support, certainly at Westminster, you know, they are very much small players, but the big players on the unionist side. But it will be fascinating to see, as you and Nick were discussing a while ago, whether tactical voting, which is very hard to get to, very hard to find evidence of, is actually a big factor. But if turnout on both sides is high, as Nick suggested, that may well be something that really has come together.
Thanks very much indeed, Laura.
Interesting thoughts there from Laura, and we'll talk to her again a little later in the day. But why don't we pause there? It's 10:04, and there should be some results coming in as we approach lunchtime, so we'll explain what we're expecting. And we'll talk to some more guests, including John McDonnell, the former Shadow Chancellor, who will be joining us from Labour in just a few minutes' time. We'll ask him for his perspective on Hartlepool and some of these local authority results as well. So that'll be interesting. In the meantime, let's have the news once again with Ben.
Huw, thank you. Good morning. Here is a summary of the BBC News. The Conservatives have taken the parliamentary seat of Hartlepool in what is being described by Labour as a shattering result. The new MP is Jill Mortimer, who is the first Tory in 56 years to represent the former Labour stronghold. Our political correspondent Helen Catt has this report.
I do hereby declare that Gillian Wendy Mortimer, commonly known as Jill Mortimer, is duly elected. Congratulations.
After decades of voting Labour, today Hartlepool has a Conservative MP. And it wasn't close. Jill Mortimer won by nearly 7,000 votes. She said her opponents had lost touch with voters.
Labour have taken people in Hartlepool for granted for too long. I heard this time and time again on the doorstep. People have had enough. And now, through this result, the people have spoken and they've made it clear it's time for change.
The Conservatives called it an historic result. 18 months after they took seat after seat in Northern England from Labour in the general election, another has turned blue. A blow-up Boris Johnson appeared in Hartlepool to mark the Tories' expected victory. The result showing the Prime Minister still commands support after Brexit. The Labour leader not speaking yet, but his party says it will listen and learn.
Absolutely shattering to see a Conservative MP elected in a place like Hartlepool after nearly 50 years. And I think what this shows is that although we have started to change since the cataclysm of the last general election, that change has clearly not gone far enough in order to win back the trust of the voters. And we've just seen that in spades, haven't we, in Hartlepool?
For the Conservatives, more celebrations as they took control of several councils, in Nuneaton and Bedworth Council in Warwickshire.
People respect what the Prime Minister has done during this pandemic. They think the vaccine rollout is phenomenal, and they think that given all the challenges that we've faced, that the Conservative government, the Prime Minister, has done a really good job in difficult circumstances, and many of those people on the doorsteps have been right behind him.
A win too in Dudley in the West Midlands. In Harlow in Essex, where they took the council from Labour. The race to count votes early here in Northumberland ended with a Conservative win too. Better news for Labour elsewhere in the North East, where they held on to several councils, including Newcastle and Gateshead, and their stronghold of Sunderland, although the Tories made inroads there too. In London, Labour's Sadiq Khan is seeking a second term. There are 13 city and regional mayors to be elected. Doncaster was the first result, a Labour mayor elected overnight. Ballot boxes have been gathered from all corners of Scotland, where the SNP are hoping to secure a majority in the Scottish Parliament. And in Wales, Labour will look to continue their run in power as votes are now counted for the 60 seats in the Senedd. The pandemic has already made these elections unusual. With much more counting still to be done, it'll be some time before the full picture of results is clear. Helen Catt, BBC News.
We will find out today how international travel will restart for England. The Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps, will give a press conference later to announce how the government will open up travel. Holidays abroad are currently banned, but a traffic light system of rules will take effect on the 17th of May, with countries classed as green, amber or red. Travellers to green countries will not need to quarantine on their return, but they will need to take a COVID test before going and coming back. Arrivals from amber countries will need to quarantine at home on return to the UK, as well as taking the same tests before departure and return. And red list countries have the strictest rules. Only UK and Ireland residents will be able to come in from those countries, and travellers will have to quarantine for 10 nights in a government-approved hotel at their own expense, in addition to the testing regime. And we will have full coverage of that press conference with the Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps. That's this evening, 5 p.m. on the BBC News Channel. The Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation is expected to recommend that people under the age of 40 should be offered an alternative vaccine to the AstraZeneca jab after concerns about blood clots. The policy currently applies to those under 30, but the age threshold could be raised as a precautionary measure. Public health officials say a version of the Indian variant of coronavirus found in the UK should be designated a variant of concern. More than 500 cases have been detected across England, with the highest levels in London and the northwest. It appears to have been spreading more quickly than other variants, but there's no evidence that it is vaccine resistant. Now, the election results will keep coming in over the next few days, and for more live coverage of the results as they come in and expert analysis of what they mean for you, you can visit our website or the BBC News app. That's it from me. Let's go back now to elections 2021.
And welcome back wherever you're joining us from to our great big election show.
Indeed, Kirsty. And what I want to do now is to bring in a very familiar and experienced figure, the former Shadow Chancellor, Labour's John McDonnell. John, good morning to you.
Hi, Huw. Good morning.
Can I just share with you, John, what I've just had from John Curtice, our guru here, which I think will give us something to talk about as well. The results so far, he says, from the key wards, the BBC study, show that Leave and working class areas are moving more strongly to the Conservatives than our Remain and more middle-class places. In the most Leave voting areas, where the last elections were in 2016, the swing from Labour to the Tories is averaging 12 points. In contrast, in most Remain voting areas, there is currently hardly any swing to the Conservatives at all. Now, does that tally with your understanding, John?
Yes, it does. In the Brexit voting areas, like Hartlepool, the Brexit carryover still exists. There's no doubt about that. And you have to take that into account. But you shouldn't take that as just the main reason. There's a whole range of factors here that need to be taken into account. John Curtice's analysis demonstrates the Brexit effect. There is the COVID effect, which is actually, I think, more about not so much congratulating Boris Johnson about the rollout of vaccinations because of some of the really critical errors he made during the pandemic, but also in a pandemic, in a crisis like this, people then generally do rally around the government in power as well. But there's a third issue as well, I think, which is more important for the Labour Party, and I'm hoping we have a proper discussion about this in the Labour Party. In this election, Helen Jones made the point earlier, you cannot go into an election without any policy program, without explaining what sort of society you want. You can't send candidates out there naked without a policies to advocate. And it's interesting, in the mayoral elections, there's something different happening. And I think that's because the individual mayors are able to set out their local policy program and they're getting rewarded for it. Whereas the Labour Party nationally has traded off for quite a while this slogan, we're under new leadership, we're under new management. But if you're saying that, you've also got to say what that means in policy terms, and you have got to explain to people what sort of society you want to create. And that hasn't happened. And I think that policy vacuum is the issue that's got to be addressed now.
So if you were to spell out to viewers where that policy vacuum is at its most acute, where is it?
I think it's tackling the real issues that people are facing. Now, just take Hartlepool, for example. We have high levels of poverty, low wages, still unemployment, insecure work. I'd like to see a Labour leadership that actually says, look, we're going to end child poverty. We're going to end child poverty, full stop. And we're going to do it in the lifetime of one parliament. We're going to make sure everyone has a minimum income guarantee. They get decent wages. We're going to make sure there's a jobs guarantee. And when people go into work, they're properly protected with trade union rights. Boom, you lay out a policy program which demonstrates the sort of society you want to create. We didn't have that. And so there was a real vacuum there. And I think that's one of the key lessons to learn from this now. The Brexit overhang, accept that, you know, people voted the way they did in the Brexit election, if you like, in December 2019, respect that, accept that, move on, and then start talking about the society we want, which is a more equal society, a society in which No one lives in poverty. A society where there's a proper social care service, the NHS is properly funded. You don't insult NHS workers with a 1% pay rise. All of those issues, I think, should be at the forefront of a policy programme we develop. And of course, the investment in areas like that is about the Green New Deal and making sure that we get there, the jobs that people need and decent wages, proper trade union rights, and at the same time tackling climate change. All of that, a real vision for the future that'll excite people again.
There'll be people watching, John, and you know it as well, in your party and elsewhere, who'll be thinking, well, hang on, Mr MacDonald was part of, a Labour leadership at the election in 2019, which, did extremely badly. And they'll be wondering, why you're offering this advice to Keir Starmer. You're clearly not a big fan of Keir Starmer. And I'm just wondering whether, this kind of approach that you have is actually saying that you're not giving him a chance.
No, well, I've never attacked Keir, and I've done everything I possibly can to ensure what happens is not what happened to Jeremy, because when Jeremy took over the leadership, we had large numbers of Labour Party MPs and others attacking him. There were even coups. And I said from the beginning that would never come from me with regard to Keir. He was elected democratically the new leader, and I've supported him throughout. But what I'm saying, you've got to have constructive criticism as well. And actually, after the last general election, it was me within 24 hours who said, if you want to blame anyone, blame me. But learn the lessons from that. And the lessons basically is that actually we didn't allow ourselves to develop a real narrative. We had a good policy programme, but we had no overall narrative that demonstrated to people effectively the sort of society we want to create. I think we did in 2017, but we lost it by 2019. And then Brexit dominated the whole election. So you learn from that. And as we move on from Brexit, we then have to fill that political vacuum by saying, this is the society we're going to create. This is how actually we're going to achieve it. It's interesting, a lot of the policies that we advocated came from places like Hartlepool. I used to tour around every other Saturday and hold seminars in towns, and I'd listen to people, and our manifesto is constructed on that basis. Ironically, the Tories now are saying they're going to implement some of those policies, like the move of the Treasury out of London to places like Darlington, the investment in infrastructure. The problem is, I don't believe they'll actually do it. I don't believe they'll roll it out on the scale that's needed. And again, what we need to do is, I think now we need to be more radical than we were in December 2019, because the problems that people face are so much more severe.
John, Kirsty here in Edinburgh, you talk about being more radical, and you've also talked about not necessarily criticising Keir Starmer. But what about his leadership style? Because very early on in his leadership, it was very clear that the left was going to be frozen out. And now Labour chit-chat is about an early reshuffle, perhaps removing Annalise Dodds, whereas Jeremy Corbyn, and indeed you, were, I would say, probably pretty loyal to people you didn't necessarily agree with. Do you think an early reshuffle is actually the answer to this?
Look, from Keir's style, and this is not a criticism, I get on well with Keir on a personal basis. We worked together for a number of years, but Keir's style and the people around his office, as far as my understanding is the leader's office has largely controlled the whole nature of the campaigning. Who goes on the media? Shadow cabinet members can't make a statement without the approval of the leader's office. They can't go on the media without the approval of the leader's office. So to actually then blame the shadow cabinet and do a reshuffle for the failure of this campaign, I think would be unfair. And I think it would be a real mistake as well. When Keir was elected, he was elected on the basis of a statement that said our policies in the last couple of manifestos were the foundational documents he would build upon, and he would unite the party. That he should fulfill that promise upon which he was elected. You shouldn't be blaming other people that you've appointed in the shadow cabinet when you've so centrally controlled the campaign. I actually think also learn the lessons of history. Learn the lessons from prime ministers like Harold Wilson, where what he did is he built cabinets of the left, right, and centre. They were rumbustious, but as a result of that debate, you got better policy decisions. And I think, that we always say the Labour Party is a broad church, left, right, and centre. That should be reflected right the way through the echelons of the party, right the way up to shadow cabinet. So I think it would be a mistake undertaking a reshuffle like that, or try to blame on others for what is really tactical or strategic decisions that have been made centrally, and I think have caused this problem.
And on the question of the curtains, because I think we should raise the curtains, as it were, it looks like the people of Hartlepool really didn't care very much about the whole issue of who paid for what. They had other more pressing concerns. So as the leader of the Labour Party, was it actually the dignified thing, wasn't actually the right thing to do, or a cheap trick to make that joke in John Lewis about curtains, when clearly people in Hartlepool want to know about their own standard of living?
You're asking someone whose jokes have fallen flat on every occasion I've ever tried to make one, I have to say. But let me just say this. What that did, it allowed Boris Johnson to turn what is, I think, quite a significant issue of corruption in government into something of a joke and insignificant. I don't think one of these issues is going to penetrate in by-elections or anything like that. But I do think over this coming period, and I think this is across all political parties, we have to have another discussion about standards of behaviour in government. And I don't like the word sleaze. Let's call it out for what it is, corruption. But at the same time, I don't like a Prime Minister who lies. And I think we should have an honest discussion about that, most probably on a cross-party basis, rather than just have it as political knockabout, because it's so fundamental to our democracy. If you have a Prime Minister who can't tell the difference between truth and lie, you have corruption in government about the distribution of contracts. That's something we haven't experienced in this country before. We should never allow our standards to slip in that way in the future. So I think there needs to be a real cross-party discussion about standards in government in the future. And then in some ways, I think in that way, people will make their judgment about politicians in the future and about the standards that they should adhere to. But I don't think it will be a central issue. The most important issues in places like Hartlepool is actually, have you got a decent roof over your head? Can you feed your children? And have you got a job? And those are the issues we've got to concentrate on.
John, good to talk to you again. And just a question on behalf of the team. How are your trombone lessons going?
It's best not to listen to me for the time being. Come back. My wife bought me some lessons. I have a weekly lesson with a wonderful young man. And I've noticed that the neighbours seem to leave their accommodation and their homes when I'm practicing. But
they say he's blowing his own trumpet again. Yeah, I know. Exactly. Yeah. Thanks, John. Thank you very much.
We'll see you again.
And now we're joined by Richard Holden, the Conservative MP for North West Durham, very firmly in the red wall, who won the seat from Labour's Laura Pidcock. First of all, on the issue of trust, we now know that the issues in Hartlepool were what people needed for their own standard of living, what they needed for their own children. But here in Scotland, Douglas Ross, the leader of the Conservative Party, said, if on the question of who paid what for whom, when, actually was found that Boris Johnson did break the ministerial code, he should resign. This may have been set to one side, but it's not gone as an issue, is it? And we've just heard John McDonnell say there that issues of standards and behaviour will have to be addressed. You can be a vote winner, but still have problems with your personal probity.
Well, it's not an issue that's come up on here in the doorsteps of County Durham very much. But the issue of trust definitely came up in Hartlepool when I was out campaigning there. And it's trust about whether Keir Starmer means what he says, because it's a real issue with Labour and that issue around Brexit. You know, they said in 2017 they'd go with it, and they didn't. Keir Starmer, at the forefront of that in 2019, now he's the leader. The truth is that the people here in the North East just don't trust Keir Starmer to fulfil what he says he's going to do. And that's one of the real issues I think Labour faced here, because if you don't trust the people's decision on Brexit, then why should they trust you with their MP?
We're also talking there to John McDonnell about the whole centralisation of what goes on within Labour, whereas actually Ben Houghton has actually gone out on his own way, if you want. I mean, for example, the nationalisation of the local airport, putting money into businesses, you know, acting very much in a kind of local democratic way, which we didn't hitherto see with previous Conservative administrations.
I think, look, Ben Houchen's been a fantastic mayor. You know, he came to power a few years ago with a very tight vote, and I hope we're really going to see him really succeed again this year. But it's not just about the airport in Tees Valley. It's about the Freeport, which is a major part of the government's agenda. It's about getting jobs and investment into the area. And it's about creating real local government. And I think this is what you're seeing in Northumbria today. I think it's what you're going to see here in County Durham today, is that people want a proactive local government who is really interested in inward investment, not in fighting historic battles of the past. And I think that's the difference that Ben's made. Ben has absolutely energised the Tees Valley. He's working with me and other MPs from across the region on transport infrastructure schemes. But I don't think this is, this isn't, I don't quite understand this sort of idea that Ben shouldn't be doing this. Ben's doing it because he's really good. You've got Andy Street down there in the West Midlands doing exactly the same. Proper civic community leadership. Not just these sinecures that we've seen for far too many Labour councillors in parts of the country for far too long.
But you can't also ignore the fact that we are in the most awkward times. We've had a massive pandemic, but I wonder if the vaccine rollout did give Boris Johnson a bounce where otherwise people would not have been so sympathetic.
I think what's really given the Conservative Party a bounce across the northeast of England and probably across the country, because you're seeing places like Harlow going to majority Conservative control, places in the Midlands, as well as here in the northeast. So I think it's across the peak. And this is the fact is that we're delivering the levelling up agenda. Yes, of course, the government will, with the vaccine task force, the fact that we're so far ahead of the rest of Europe, that's obviously going to have some impact. But this is really a positive vote. We've seen turnouts in my constituency up by half, from 25 to 40% in local elections. Some of my wards are at 55% turnout in local elections this year. They're going out there voting for Conservative candidates the first time in a lot of these areas. I go into these elections with no Conservative councillors. I can tell you now, from the Louisa Centre behind me and Spennymoor, where the count's happening today, we're going to have some Conservative councillors coming out of them later. The doorsteps have been
Richard,
phenomenal
thank you
around.
very much indeed.
Right.
Richard, thank you.
Thank you.
I'd just say I was very impressed with Richard's camera work there, because I think he was actually on his iPhone or whatever phone he has on a kind of selfie stick, or maybe actually his arm, but actually it was very, very impressive and pretty stable, and lots of my camera colleagues will be rather envious at that skill, I would have thought. So well done to him. That was Richard Holden there. So we've been talking about local authorities in England and some of the important trends. We've been talking about Scotland and what's at stake there, not least for the future of the Union, of the United Kingdom. There are 60 seats up for the Welsh Parliament, the Senedd, and that again is interesting because it is a Labour administration that's been there in Cardiff, either in coalition or not, for the last 22 years. And they are facing a tough challenge, partly from the Conservatives and partly from Plaid Cymru. So if we want an example of Welsh Labour having to fight off a Conservative challenge, we can go to the Vale of Glamorgan, which is not far from Cardiff, a lovely part of the world. And this is the count going on in Barry, the famous former coal dock in Barry, which is part of the Vale of Glamorgan. And this has been, in Westminster terms, a Labour Conservative seat. It's Conservative at the moment. In Senedd terms, in Cardiff Bay, it has been Labour all along. A very well-known member of the Senedd, Jane Hutt, who's been a former finance minister in the Welsh Government. So she has decided to stand again. Some people thought she might stand down, but she's standing again. And the Conservatives have been making very confident noises about this seat, as they have about other seats in Wales, not least in the northeast of Wales. So there's a big challenge for Labour. Let's see how that works out with the Conservatives. Ione Wells is in Cardiff, keeping an eye on everything for us. What can we expect?
Well, Huw, as you say, this is a defensive election for Labour. They've been in power since devolution began here in Wales for more than 2 decades. So the big question really today is how many of their seats might the opposition parties be able to chip away at? Now, as you say, the big threat really here that they face is from the Conservatives, particularly in the northeast of Wales, the so-called Red Wall area where Labour lost a number of seats to the Conservatives at the 2019 general election. election on a UK level. That's one of the kind of key areas to watch in this election. Also, as you've just touched on there, the Vale of Glamorgan in South Wales. Again, a Tory seat in Westminster, Labour in the Senedd. That's somewhere that the Tories have got their eye on, and a number of people I've been speaking to this week pretty confident that they have increased support there. I mean, it's telling, for example, that the Prime Minister just this week was wheeled out to go campaigning in Barry in the Vale of Glamorgan, a sign that, you know, they think they're pretty confident that they may be able to make gains there as well. A couple of seats to watch out for as well, where Labour and Plaid Cymru are in direct competition with one another, particularly Llanelli, which is the most marginal seat in Wales. That's a seat which Plaid Cymru are really keen to nab from the Labour Party. Also Rhondda, one which is currently held by Plaid, but which Labour really would like to win back. That was a bit of a surprise win for Plaid Cymru at the last election in 2016. So there's a couple of key seats there to watch out for. The other thing, of course, to remember when it comes to Senedd elections is that, as you've touched on, no party has ever won a majority here. Labour have been in power since devolution began, but with the support of other parties as well. So if by this evening we're seeing the numbers go that way again, it may be that parties are going to start having to look a bit about, you know, what deals may or may not they be able to put on the table with other parties as well.
Two very different campaigns by Boris Johnson in Wales and Scotland. He was in Barry just on Tuesday, yet he hasn't set foot in Scotland throughout this whole election campaign. I wonder what the calculation might be there.
That's right, Kirsty. I mean, I think it's quite interesting. I've spoken to a number of sources about this in the Conservative Party, and they are acknowledging that Boris Johnson as a figure isn't particularly popular in Scotland. However, the picture's a bit different in Wales. You know, both sources on both the Conservative side and the Labour Party here in Wales have kind of characterised this campaign really as a bit of a contest between Boris Johnson and the Welsh Labour leader Mark Drakeford. Interestingly, the Labour UK leader Keir Starmer not really playing as big a role in this campaign in Wales. Obviously, we've heard a lot this morning about Hartlepool and about this being a kind of, you know, on a UK-wide level, these results being a test for Keir Starmer. Don't think that's really the case here. I think we've got to remember just how much of a spotlight the last year and a half has given to the Labour leader Mark Drakeford. He's been on TV giving COVID press conferences all the time. He's somebody who polls suggest actually more people in Wales have an opinion on than on the UK Labour leader Keir Starmer. I heard even from one Labour MP the other day that they were out campaigning and they were in a pub which had quite a kind of mixed demographic, but certainly quite a sort of Brexit supporting area. And Mark Drakeford walked in and people just got up and started applauding. It's almost like he's been a bit of a celebrity really on this campaign trail. And that's something which Labour certainly have in their favour in this campaign. So very much a kind of race between him as a leader and Boris Johnson, who, as we've discussed already, led the Conservatives on a UK level to a very successful result here in 2019, winning 6 seats overall in Wales.
Ione, that's fascinating, and they're themes that we want to pick up a little later. Quick reminder, what are you expecting first, sorry, as a result? The earliest thing you're expecting?
Well, we haven't got sort of set times in terms of exact results, but I think some to watch out for early on are going to be Carmarthen East and Dynevor. This is the seat held by the Plaid Cymru leader Adam Price. That's one we're expecting early on. Another one we're expecting earlier on today is Vale of Clwyd. Now, this one is going to be really interesting to watch because this is one of those northeast red wall seats which the Conservatives really want to win from Labour, and it's one that's going to be fought on very, very tight margins as well.
Ione, good to talk to you. Thank you.
And now we can have Ben and the news and also hopefully on the weather because it's very changeable here in Edinburgh.
Yeah, Kirsty, thank you very much indeed. Good morning. Here is a summary of the BBC News. And Labour has described the loss of its parliamentary seat of Hartlepool to the Conservatives in a by-election as absolutely shattering. The new MP is Jill Mortimer, who is the first Tory in 56 years to represent the former Labour stronghold. She has a resounding majority of 6,940. Well, the Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer was asked about the loss of the Hartlepool constituency this morning as he left home, but he has yet to comment. The Tories have also made gains across local councils. They have taken control of 4 councils, gaining 57 seats compared to Labour losses of 60 seats. 17 local authorities have declared their results, but there are 126 which are still counting votes. And as we've been hearing, counting in the Scottish parliamentary election began this morning. Voters were choosing 129 MSPs to be elected to the Scottish Parliament, but COVID restrictions meant there was no overnight vote counting this year. The final results are expected on Saturday. Counting's also begun in the Welsh elections to the Senedd, 60 seats up for grabs, and some voters reported queues outside polling stations. Most results are expected this afternoon and into the early evening. Results in 4 Wales Police and Crime Commissioner elections are due on Sunday. Meanwhile, the first result in the regional mayoral elections has been announced. Labour's Ros Jones has secured a 3rd term as Doncaster's mayor, with a majority of over 10,000. Votes are still being counted for the 12 other directly elected mayors, but results are not expected until the weekend. Other news, and the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation is expected to recommend that people aged under 40 should be offered an alternative vaccine to the AstraZeneca jab after concerns about blood clots. The policy currently applies to those under 30, but the age threshold could be raised as a precautionary measure. Dozens of firefighters are tackling a blaze at a 19-storey block of flats in Poplar in East London. Parts of the 8th, 9th and 10th floors of the building near the Blackwall Tunnel are alight. There are now over 100 firefighters and 20 fire engines at the scene. We will bring you more on this as it comes into us. We'll find out today how international travel will restart for England. The Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps, will be giving a press conference later on to announce how the government will open up travel. Holidays abroad are currently banned, but a traffic light system of rules will take effect on the 17th of May, with countries classed as either green, amber or red. And joining me now is Axel Hefer, who's the Chief Executive of Trivago. Thank you very much indeed for being with us, Axel. What are you expecting or hoping to hear today?
So overall, it is important for travellers to have some certainty of the return, of a safe return. And I would hope that there will be some clarity on which countries already right now are making it to the green list. So where can you go safely without any problems coming back with the self-isolation? And also a clear visibility on how more countries will be added to that list with progress of the vaccination rollout, in particular in Southern Europe, over the weeks to come.
Which countries do you think will be on the green list?
To be honest, I don't know. It's very difficult to judge from the outside. I think for the summer, it will matter a lot that the top destinations for UK travellers, like Spain, like Portugal, will at some point in time make it on the list, because that's where people want to travel to. And there is progress in these countries, and I do expect them to have sufficient progress that safe travel will be possible for summer.
And what are you seeing at Trivago in terms of bookings for the summer?
Yeah, so what we do see consistently is once there is a certainty that you can return without self-isolation and quarantine requirements, there is an immediate wave of bookings. So after the very, very difficult times and the long lockdowns that we all have gone through, there's a huge desire to travel. But unless this is clear, there is some hesitancy to book. So it will be all about the countries that make it to the list. And for those countries, we do expect an immediate surge in bookings.
So you're probably going to get a rush of bookings after today's announcement. But we're also reading that prices are starting to skyrocket to places that potentially people will be able to go to.
Yeah, as long as there are only few countries on the list, that is very, very likely. And again, I mean, it will be important to really offer all the popular destinations at some point in time later in the summer, once the infections have come down in those regions. If that is happening too late, it is very likely that the countries that make it on the green list will see a surge in demand that is surpassing even the offering, and that is leading to an increase in prices.
Axel Hefer, Chief Executive of Trivago, thank you very much for being with us. Thanks for your time. And just to say, we'll be giving you full live coverage of that press conference with Grant Shapps, the Transport Secretary. That's this evening, 5 p.m. on the BBC News Channel. Now, we'll be back with elections 2021 in just a moment. First, though, let's take a look at the latest weather forecast for you now, and Carol Kirkwood has that.
Hello again. For many of us, it was a chilly start to the day, but also a dry one and a bright one with just a few showers. We'll see further showers develop through the course of the day, though, and again, some of those will be heavy, particularly in eastern areas, with the potential for some hail and some thunder. And at the same time, cloud will thicken across the southwest, heralding the arrival of an area of low pressure later on. Temperatures 7 to about 15 as we push further south. Now, through this evening, under clear skies, temperatures will fall away quite quickly. And as this system comes in from the southwest, it will not only bring rain and gusty winds, it will also bring some milder air with it. Except for across northern England and Scotland, you will still have relatively clear skies. So in rural areas, you're prone to a touch of frost. So through tomorrow, here is that Atlantic low with all its weather fronts around it, producing some heavy rain at times, especially in the west, and windy conditions. But note the temperatures rising, still unsettled on Sunday, but higher temperatures by then.
Welcome back from Kirsty and from me here at the BBC's election studios in London and in Edinburgh. We've been talking about the importance of the elections in Scotland. We mentioned Wales just before we went to the news there. Let's have another look then at the local elections in England. 143 local authorities, plus mayoral contests, plus police and crime commissioners. They're coming as well a bit later on. Now, the interesting thing here is that we've been talking all along about what will be the effect of the pandemic? Is this going to be a COVID election? Will turnout be down? Campaigning has been hampered. People haven't been able to knock on doors as they wanted to. So the effect of the pandemic clearly was, in many people's view, going to lead to a much lower turnout. Well, according to Sir John Curtice, and we'll talk to John a little later on, the turnout in the English local elections at this stage, if anything, is not down, it's slightly up. And John's saying there's little sign that the pandemic has had a negative impact on turnout in the local council elections in England. Currently, it's running slightly above the position in 2016-17, and this suggests that in the end, the turnout will be around 35%, which is typical of the position for English local elections. So that's a very interesting note from John and context for us as we see more of these results coming in. So let's update on where the local results are. There have been some notable Conservative gains. The story so far is not a good one for Labour, and it's a very encouraging one for the Conservatives. Reeta, tell us more.
As you say, encouraging picture for the Conservatives here. Here are some of the latest results that we've had in overnight and into the early hours of the morning. And what they do suggest is that particularly in Leave voting areas, the Conservatives have really advanced. So in Dudley, Harlow, Nuneaton and also Northumberland, these are all Conservative gains. Redditch and Thurrock they've hung on to, and the two Labour holds here are Oldham and Sunderland. Now, what we are also looking at here, though, as well as the Leave Remain divide, is the fact that we've got, in a sense, two sets of elections being fought this time round, because last year's that were meant to be held were delayed because of COVID. That is going to make something, may make something of a difference in the way in which we interpret the results, and I want to show you how. So Redditch, for example, which is just south of Birmingham, this result came in the small hours, about 2:30 in the morning. It's a Conservative hold. Now, these seats were last up for election in 2016. That's important because back then, both Labour and the Conservatives were roughly level pegging in terms of their share of the vote. Whereas now, the opinion polls suggest that the Conservatives are doing considerably better than Labour. That's important because we would then expect to see the Conservatives really going ahead in a seat in a council like Redditch, so in the seats that are up here. And if we take a look at the figures, they'll just show you, Labour's lost 7 seats, Conservatives have gained those 7 seats, and the share of the vote, Conservatives getting over half of the vote, And look at that share change since last time these seats were up. Conservatives up 27%, clearly benefiting massively from the drop in the UKIP vote. Now, I want to contrast Redditch, so a really strong performance by the Conservatives in Redditch, with their gain in Northumberland. Now, Northumberland was last up for election in 2017. That's important because in 2017, the Conservatives performed very well. They were 10 percentage points ahead of Labour. It was a high watermark. They were further ahead of Labour than the opinion polls suggest that they are now. So we would expect the advance by the Conservatives to be rather less here. You might ask me why I'm saying that, because it's a Conservative gain. It is. They have gained this council. They've now got a majority of 1. Labour have lost 3 seats, but it is the change in the share of the vote that's so interesting. Look at that. Labour has actually put on a bit of support in Northumberland. So although this is, of course, undoubtedly a good result for the Conservatives, there are nuances behind the overall result. Let me just show you where we are in terms of overall figures. So we've only had 16 of the councils, so we're very early in the day, 16 out of 143 councils declared, and that is the scoreboard in terms of where we are with all of the parties.
Reeta, thank you very much. Earlier, we were talking to the former Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell, who was, of course, the key member, really, in Jeremy Corbyn's leadership, and he was saying, look, one of our problems is that we are simply not talking the kind of language that voters want to hear. We're not talking in the language that people want. And there's been lots of interesting Labour reaction, some of it on the record, some of it off the record, along the lines of what John was telling us. Have a look at this from Luke Akers, who's a Labour NEC member. And he's saying this: if you're one of the massive slice of the public who's older, or a car driver, or a homeowner, or voted for Brexit, you would think the Tories care about you and Labour doesn't. Until we change that, those people will increasingly not vote for us and we will not win. Now, this is a theme, I think, that we are going to hear more about as the day goes on and as the results come in. Vicky Young is with us now, our Deputy Political Editor, keeping me company here in the studio. Vicky, can we start with that Luke Akers quote? Because does that tally with what you're hearing from Labour?
Yeah, we're going to, as you say, get a lot of that from MPs who I would say, Labour MPs all over the country, actually, who are deeply alarmed, actually. I think because we've heard Keir Starmer talk about the huge mountain Labour has to climb. We all know that. They've had some devastating general election results. It's about getting back onto that and making those steps. What they're really worried about is they're still falling down that mountain, and that's what they think some of these results are showing. Now, part of that is about understanding why people vote Conservative. It's a basic point, but it's one that they fear that the Labour Party hasn't yet grasped. There's been lots of analysis of what went wrong in 2019. There are obviously lots in the party who blame Jeremy Corbyn and his leadership. They think that really did fracture the relationship with many of their traditional seats. But now it's about how do you rebuild that? Can you rebuild that? One Labour source saying to us, actually, we've got to change, otherwise we are on the precipice of never being relevant again. And that word, relevant or irrelevant, that's come up. I've spoken to Labour MPs this morning saying they don't have anything to say to the electorate. Now, they understand that Sir Keir Starmer's plan was to come in the first year really to talk about being under different management, because he did feel that there was a problem with Jeremy Corbyn's leadership. But now it's about what happens next when it comes to policy. And a fear too amongst some Labour MPs that actually you're going to have to upset some Labour Party members. You're going to have to say some things that they won't like. They've got to start understanding why people vote for Boris Johnson, and lots of them cannot understand that. And until they do, they're not going to be able to come up with the policies that then lead potentially to clawing back. And the real fear for some is that they've seen what's happened to Labour in Scotland, and they fear now it's moving to the northeast of England and to the Midlands. And where are they going to get their votes from?
So the brutal question there is, 1 year into Keir Starmer's leadership, are you detecting that there is an increase in the number of party colleagues who are losing faith in his ability to deliver, or is it too early to say that?
I don't think there's the sense that they're going to move against him at the moment, but I think there is a sense that something much more radical has to be done in terms of policy. And that is, as one said to me, it's not just about tacking a little bit one way or the other. It's got to be a complete shift in direction and not worrying so much about unity. Now, you can see why Sir Keir Starmer's team would say the party had been riven by internal fighting because of Jeremy Corbyn's leadership and the reaction from, mainly the Labour Party in Parliament. And he had to talk about unity. And of course, it's been difficult. There's been a pandemic. Getting involved and being a constructive opposition is difficult too. Being too critical, people do in a way want to pull behind a government when you're in a national crisis. There's been all sorts of elements of that. But I think from now, he's going to have to show that he's got those policy ideas that are relevant to people, they would say, not just in metropolitan areas, not just in university areas, not just amongst the well-educated, but in those places where Labour, over the years have had huge support, but it seems to have shifted away from them.
OK, we'll talk a bit more about that as more results come in, Vicky, because, some of the results may present different patterns for us. And of course, we'll talk about the other parties as well. But for now, thanks.
And now we're joined by Stephen Bush from the New Statesman, who's in central London, and Katie Balls of The Spectator, who is at Westminster. So much to unpick this morning. Good morning to both of you. Katie Balls, first of all. Now, do you think that after all the noise and bluster over the last 2 or 3 weeks about sleaze and Boris Johnson, the sleaze is now ebbing away quickly?
Yeah, I think we can see that when we're looking at the results coming in, Wallpapergate, as it has come to be known, has not dented the Tories in the way that Labour would have hoped it would. And ultimately, it's other issues that I think have been the dominant ones in motivating people to get out there and, in what it seems many areas, continue to vote Conservative. I think that if we're looking at the sleaze allegations, a lot of those are going to run their own course. If you look at the Electoral Commission inquiry into the number 10 flat. But in terms of Boris Johnson's stock right now in the Tory party is incredibly high. He has a transactional relationship with his party. They back him because they think he's a winner. I think that the results coming in are going to confirm that view amongst his MPs.
Well, you are always laser focused on what's going on in Downing Street. And I wonder if you think, Katie, that after this, the whole Downing Street situation will settle down. We'll have people in position who are consolidating their position, and there will actually be a calming of the waters at Downing Street.
I mean, I think potentially that could happen. I think the other thing that might happen is MPs just accept that Downing Street can be quite a chaotic place. And perhaps that's not such a problem to them if you're getting results like this. Because ultimately, the factional infighting in number 10, I think, is about more than just results. It goes back, to various rows in the past. And actually, Tory MPs will mind a lot less about that as long as they don't think it's affecting them in terms of their seats.
Stephen, can I bring you in? It's Huw. I'm just wondering what you make of the elements of the debate, and, they are early elements, I admit that, about what Labour's response should be. We've had some voices already, but given what's going on in Hartlepool and the trend that we're seeing elsewhere so far, where do you think that Labour debate will go?
I mean, with the massive disclaimer, then it's, I think, very difficult to say when we don't have results from two very important battlegrounds for the Labour Party, Wales and London, right? Because let's imagine a situation where Mark Drakeford carries all before him. A hugely popular politician, surprised a lot of people who thought that the Welsh Labour Party might struggle after Karen Jones stepped down. If he can point to having one seat, back in the Red Wall, those seats in the north of Wales that they lost in 2019, then that will be an argument that, oh look, here's a way that we can win again. If in London, say, the Liberal Democrats and the Greens enjoy a revival, actually Labour goes backwards, that might then cause people to go, oh, but look, we haven't managed to take a bite out of the votes that we've been losing to the Conservatives in the last decade, and we've created another problem in our other heartland. So at the moment, I think it's quite hard to predict exactly how this debate's going to shake out without those results. But I think it's fascinating that you have Labour people saying we need to understand why people vote Tory, and none of them really seem to be willing to entertain the opinion on either the right or the left of the Labour Party that maybe the main thing that these local elections are about is that people can go outside, enjoy a meal cooked by someone other than themselves outside their own home. In a couple of weeks' time, they'll be able to hug their mothers, their siblings, etc., etc. And it does feel a bit strange when the Labour Party has decided that what these results are really about is them.
Stephen, Kirsty here. Just when you look at, the Tories have taken Basildon, so we're talking about Basildon, we're talking about the northeast and the Red Wall. This is not geographically constrained at the moment. The Conservatives are doing pretty well all over where the results are coming in. Now that must be a much more major worry for Labour.
Yeah, as I say, the difficulty is at the moment we don't have quite a large chunk of results, not least Basildon is another one of the 2016 results. So yeah, an era when UKIP were doing well, the Liberal Democrats were doing well, and before the very big successes of the Greens in 2017, 18, and particularly 19. So it's still possible that all of this looks quite different when we have those results from an election a lot more like the politics we have now. No UKIP vote in 2017 to speak of, two big parties duking it out. At the moment, of course, as you say, in some ways the worries are easier because they just have a problem with everywhere where there aren't loads of graduates, everywhere outside of the core cities. So that means Labour's debate is not that fraught. But as I say, if at the end of the day, Labour MPs in cities are going, actually, this has created a problem for me because the Greens are now a strong second in my seat, or the Lib Dems, who I won this seat from in 2015 or 2010, they look like they're coming back. That's, I think, when the debate becomes properly fraught, because at the moment, Labour's problem is everywhere, but it's only in one direction. Not a great situation from winning an election, but in terms of their internal health, that's a better place for them to be in debate-wise.
Stephen, good of you to join us. Thank you very much. And Katie, lovely to have you with us. Thank you.
Huw, so things are sort of shaking down early on to say that the consolidation of the Conservative vote may actually be replicated in Scotland, as they are seen as the main party to save the Union, which spells bad news for Labour in Scotland as well.
Well, I thought Stephen, on that point actually, Kirsty, I thought Stephen made a very, very interesting point there about the situation in parts of Wales, because, if you want to test, which parallels some of those in Scotland, in these parliaments, if you want a test of the Conservatives against Labour in traditional Labour areas, well, then North East Wales provides that. The areas around Wrexham and Clwyd South and the Vale of Clwyd and, Alun and Deeside and Delyn, these are seats which really were heavy Brexit areas, most of which went to the Conservatives in the last general election. And they've been areas where Labour this time has been putting a lot of work in. So if we want a barometer of where Labour can show it can do well, and Stephen's suggesting that that might give some comfort to Keir Starmer, well then that's one of the areas we need to focus on today, because I think it provides us with a really good example of Labour under pressure from the Conservatives.
Mind you, it was so interesting hearing Iona say that the big tickets, the big personalities in Wales latterly have been Mark Drakeford and Boris Johnson. That there's no doubt that Mark Drakeford has really come through on a personal level through the pandemic and actually shown people what he can do with the power of devolution.
Well, I think some of it is partly to do with the obvious, Kirsty. You've got Boris Johnson chairing those press conferences almost on a daily basis, millions of people watching them day after day after day. So clearly, apart from the fact that he's Prime Minister, he's had even more kind of visibility in that sense. Mark Drakeford is a very interesting case because he was seen before as, a decent, quiet man, not very exciting. I don't mean any offence to you, Mark, at all, if you're watching. But, not seen as somebody who's going to set the world alight. Well, actually, those qualities seem to have commended themselves. Yes, he's done his daily press conferences. Yes, his visibility has gone up. But actually, people telling me when I go back to Wales, certainly, and people in the polls are saying they rather like the quality of, steady, safe, slightly academic, measured approach. All of it sort of carefully stated. People have been reassured by that. Mm-hmm. So there are different forms of celebrity. You can have the Boris Johnson show celebrity, have a bit of fun, and you can have the celebrity of someone like Mark Drakeford, who takes a completely different approach to things. But, this is all politics. And, to suggest that people fall for one style because it's a bit more, showbiz, is completely wrong. Voters will focus on who is delivering. There's no question about that. And that, I think, is why Mark Drakeford, with the vaccine rollout, for example, has been, has seen his popularity go up.
Yeah. Joined now by Rob Mayer in Walsall. Rob, our correspondent in Walsall today. I mean, this is Westminster, this is Andy Street coming up. The Conservatives have put on votes. They held the council, but they've actually increased their vote. What is the atmosphere like there?
Well, following on from those Labour disasters in Hartlepool and elsewhere, Kirsty, we've had the same in the Midlands overnight. The Conservatives winning Nuneaton and Bedworth, picking up 11 seats, taking control of Dudley and winning gaining 12 seats in the process. Also holding on to Redditch and winning all 9 seats that were up for election there. There will be counting will get underway here in Walsall in a couple of hours, but Conservatives have a real spring in their step about what they might expect over the next day and a half or so, expecting to make gains not only here in Walsall but also places like Wolverhampton, where they've struggled for years, Sandwell, which until recently was a council where 72 of the seats were held by 72 Labour councillors. And of course, some big worries on the Labour side about what this all means for the West Midlands mayor election and whether Liam Byrne can topple Andy Street. I was in a sports hall in Dudley about 7 o'clock this morning as the results were trickling in, and one Conservative councillor said to me, look, usually at this point we've done our count, I go to bed and get some sleep. He said, I'm definitely staying up to watch this time.
So, in fact, the Liam Byrne, 2 weeks ago, Liam Byrne was full of bravado that he was going to win in West Midlands. Do you think unlikely?
It feels like he's up against it. Labour have done terribly in places like Dudley overnight. You speak to Labour councillors, they're not sure the campaign has gone well enough, that Liam Byrne hasn't spent enough time, perhaps, in places like the Black Country. Of course, he's relying on a big Labour vote in Birmingham, but there are no local elections in Birmingham this time, no local council elections. So they are worried about what the turnout will be there and whether it will be enough for Liam Byrne to get past Andy Street. Andy Street seems to have a spring in his step over the last couple of days, but has been stressing that it was very, very close, just 1% the difference last time. So we'll find out on mid-afternoon on Saturday. But yeah, Labour supporters here really, really worried about what's to come over the next 24 hours.
Thank you very much indeed, Rob.
We'll have the news in just a moment, but we're getting more reaction in from within the Labour Party and to some of the results that we've had so far. Basildon in Essex, we talked about it earlier. Gavin Callaghan, the council leader, says this. The overall results are a bitter blow for Basildon. Means I will no longer be leader of the council. I regret that we will not have the chance to continue making the progress in changing the council, transforming our borough that we have set in motion. I wish my Conservative successor as leader of the council every success. And the problem is, of course, for Labour and indeed for lots of independents who are fighting, is that there is this surge of Conservative support that we're seeing in many parts of England, certainly, and we'll see if that continues as the day goes on. Let's catch up with the news, and it's Ben.
Huw, good morning. Thank you very much. Here is a summary of the BBC News. The Conservatives have taken the parliamentary seat of Hartlepool in what is being described by Labour as a shattering result. The new MP is Jill Mortimer, who is the first Tory in 56 years to represent the former Labour stronghold. Our political correspondent Helen Catt has this report.
I do hereby declare that Gillian Wendy Mortimer, commonly known as Jill Mortimer, is duly elected. Congratulations.
After decades of voting Labour, today Hartlepool has a Conservative MP. And it wasn't close. Jill Mortimer won by nearly 7,000 votes. She said her opponents had lost touch with voters.
Labour have taken people in Hartlepool for granted for too long. I heard this time and time again on the doorstep. People have had enough. And now, through this result, the people have spoken and they've made it clear it's time for change.
The Conservatives called it an historic result. 18 months after they took seat after seat in Northern England from Labour in the general election, another has turned blue. A blow-up Boris Johnson appeared in Hartlepool to mark the Tories' expected victory. The results showing the Prime Minister still commands support after Brexit. The Labour leader not speaking yet, but his party says it will listen and learn.
The question for us is, how do we make sure that we get heard? How do we make sure that our ideas are communicated in a positive and practical way, and that we are able to bring people with us, which quite clearly in the case of Hartlepool we haven't done. So yes, we have to ask ourselves that question. I think everybody understands the need for change, and that is where our focus should be.
For the Conservatives, more celebrations as they took control of several councils, in Nuneaton and Bedworth Council in Warwickshire.
People respect what the Prime Minister has done during this pandemic. They think the vaccine rollout is phenomenal, and they think that given all the challenges that we've faced, that the Conservative government, the Prime Minister, has done a really good job in difficult circumstances, and many of those people on the doorsteps have been right behind him.
A win too in Dudley in the West Midlands. In Harlow in Essex, where they took the council from Labour. The race to count votes early here in Northumberland ended with a Conservative win too. Better news for Labour elsewhere in the North East, where they held on to several councils, including Newcastle and Gateshead, and their stronghold of Sunderland, although the Tories made inroads there too. In London, Labour's Sadiq Khan is seeking a second term. There are 13 city and regional mayors to be elected. Doncaster was the first result, a Labour mayor elected overnight. Ballot boxes have been gathered from all corners of Scotland, where the SNP are hoping to secure a majority in the Scottish Parliament. Both those who are pro-independence and those against keeping a close eye on how the votes are stacking up. And in Wales, Labour will look to continue their run in power as votes are now counted for the 60 seats in the Senedd. The pandemic has already made these elections unusual. With much more counting still to be done, it'll be some time before the full picture of results is clear. Helen Catt, BBC News.
The Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation is expected to recommend that people aged under 40 should be offered an alternative vaccine to the Oxford-AstraZeneca jab after concerns about blood clots. The policy currently applies to those under 30, but the age threshold could be raised as a precautionary measure. Viewers on the BBC News channel can see that news conference live in about half an hour's time. We'll find out today how international travel will restart for England. The Transport Secretary Grant Shapps will be giving a press conference later to announce how the government will open up travel. Holidays abroad are currently banned, but a new traffic light system of rules will take effect on the 17th of May. With countries classed as green, amber or red, travellers to green countries will not need to quarantine on their return, but they will need to take a COVID test before going and coming back. Arrivals from amber countries will need to quarantine at home on return to the UK, as well as taking the same tests before departure and return. And the red list countries have the strictest rules. Only UK and Ireland residents will be able to come in from those countries, and travellers will have to quarantine for 10 nights in a government-approved hotel at their own expense, in addition to the testing regime. And we'll have full conference coverage of that press conference by the Transport Secretary. It's this evening, 5 p.m. on the BBC News channel. Firefighters have been tackling a blaze at a 19-storey block of flats in Poplar in East London. Parts of the 8th, 9th and 10th floors of the building near the Blackwall Tunnel were alight. There are now some 100 firefighters and 20 fire engines at the scene, and we'll bring you more on that as we get it. The election results will keep coming in over the next few days, and you can find out the latest results where you live by just entering your postcode into our search tool on our BBC News website or the BBC News app. For now, though, let's go back to Elections 2021.
Just turned 11 o'clock, and thanks to Ben for the news. Welcome from Kirsty and from me once again. We are just waiting for the flood of results to come in across England, Scotland and Wales. We've had a few significant ones already, haven't we, Kirsty?
We have indeed, and of course very significant is Basildon. Remember Basildon, man? We can be joined now by our correspondent Simon Dedman. Tories have done extremely well in Basildon. Take us through it.
Well, we still haven't had the flood of results, but we've had a very important trickle. We've had 4 wards which Labour should have held. They have lost 3 of them. And as I was saying the last time we spoke, Labour had a majority of 1 with independents. It basically means if the Conservatives hold everything they already have, they've got a majority. And in the last hour, as Huw was mentioning before the news, Gavin Callaghan, the Labour leader of Basildon, has already quit. He's changed his status on Twitter to former leader of Basildon Council, and he's standing down as the Labour group leader. The Conservatives walking around here have got smiles on their faces. They've been cheering when the results come in. Labour also tell me they expect to lose at least 1 other ward. So it is looking like the Conservatives are on course to take this council, as they did with Harlow in the early hours this morning. Meanwhile, on the county council, the Conservatives are still a net 4 down. That doesn't mean that they won't keep their majority, but so far it has been hit. The Lib Dems have made 1 net gain, and there's also been 3 gains for residents' parties.
Simon, thank you.
Interesting there in Basildon, so we'll see what happens. But we heard there that the former Labour leader of the council, as I was mentioning earlier, has already just said, well, you know, game over, even though all the results aren't in yet. Let's talk about Hartlepool once again, where Labour had a very bad result. The Conservatives had a very good result in the parliamentary by-election, just one parliamentary by-election taking place overnight. Let's talk to my colleague Megan Patterson, who's there. Megan, we've talked a lot here, and Kirsty has as well, about the factors. I'm just wondering, you know, do you put this down to some kind of feel-good factor around the vaccine rollout, about, you know, acknowledging that Brexit has happened? Or, you know, what are local people telling you that's behind this result?
Well, this morning, people here in Hartlepool, the ones we've spoken to anyway, seem to be in a fairly jubilant mood. Lots of people have said, well, it's time for a change, let's push forward, let's see what happens now. There does seem to be that sense of looking forward positively. It's been a difficult 18 months for many, many people here and across the country. This by-election for some might have been a chance to look forward to what the future is. Many people saying they feel that Boris Johnson's party has done a good job dealing with the pandemic. Of course, though, there are people on the other side, Labour campaigners, who felt that, well, this area has been neglected for too long. So there's a mixture of emotions this morning, but certainly a degree of surprise, if not shock, at this substantial victory for Jill Mortimer. Not just a victory for the Conservatives, but a almost 7,000 vote majority is quite a shock in this area, which was, of course, once considered Labour heartland. Peter Mandelson used to have a majority here. That feels like a very long time ago now. People here in Hartlepool keen for a fresh start. And obviously today is about celebrations for the Conservatives. It's about Labour looking at what they could do better. What do they do now? This should be a place where they can win. But for people in Hartlepool, from tomorrow they'll be asking, well, what happens now? There are pockets of deprivation here that need to be tackled. Unemployment is a big issue. There needs to be jobs, there needs to be investment. So today, yes, reflection, positivity, a bit of a bounce, but from tomorrow, well, what happens and how do we make it happen and to improve things here?
Megan, thank you very much. That's good to hear that. I want to stay talking about the northeast of England and bring in Laura Pidcock, the former Labour MP in County Durham, knows the area obviously extremely well. Laura, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, good morning.
Well, you know this part of the world, as I say, like the back of your hand, really. And I'm just wondering, you know, when you see the Hartlepool result, did you expect a defeat for Labour on that scale?
I'm not shocked that there was a defeat in Hartlepool. It is obviously absolutely devastating that there is a Conservative MP representing Hartlepool as well, Huw. You know, results coming in from former coal mining communities like New Hartley and Seg Hill, where they're returning Tory county councillors. it's staggering. You know, in New Hartley, there was a pit disaster. There are strong or were strong connections to that Labour movement tied to industry. And what happened in Hartlepool, I think, is a result of lots of different things. I think I'll start by saying this, though, that, you know, the staggering cuts that have been given by government to local authorities and in every constituency feeling that pain. It isn't a victory for the people of Hartlepool to have a Tory MP. They might disassociate themselves with that national government cuts, but it is squarely with the government. You know, poverty pay, cuts to services, all of that has really hurt and harmed our communities, and that is on this government. But I do think that the Labour Party failed to communicate effectively in the last year about what we actually believe in, and that, you know, of course, is with the leadership of the Labour Party. I think there was far too much introspection, far too many attacks on Labour members, the activist base, the people who go out and communicate the message about why people should vote for Labour. And I think that is a massive wasted amount of time, because, you know, we're coming out of a crisis now. People are really worried about the future. Still kind of this lingering sense of coronavirus being there, lots of restrictions. And what we need is a bold opposition who are speaking up for working class communities in all of their diversity, speaking for the whole of the United Kingdom, and taking on this terrible government.
I mean, there are lots of elements there, Laura. I mean, you know, we could talk for 2 hours about all of that, to be honest.
I'll stay on for 2 hours here if you want and chat.
well, some other time, Laura, OK? But listen, I do want to just make this point, because it's come up several times. The suggestion, I don't know whether you were trying to suggest it, the suggestion that somehow people in Hartlepool were voting Conservative with a heavy heart, you know, that they were doing it reluctantly. There's been a lot of pushback on that, with people saying, hang on, we voted Conservative because we wanted to, because actually the Conservatives are speaking a language that we actually relate to, and Labour isn't doing that. Now, are you in a position to say, well, yes, there's a lot of wisdom in that, and the kind of bold policy platform that you're talking about needs to be in tune with what people find attractive. That is to say, investing in regions, that is to say, bringing jobs in, which lots of people say the Conservatives are now managing to do in the northeast of England. So what's the response to that?
Well, we have no material evidence of that investment. There is lots of superficial rhetoric about levelling up. It's vacuous, it's hollow, it'll deliver nothing for working class communities, because the problems are structural. And so if we're talking about endemic, you know, in-work poverty pay, if we're talking about the decimation of the welfare system, which loads of people in work interact with and out of work, if we're talking about severe cuts to services, that all still exists. If we think about Durham County Council, they were forced to make £180 million worth of cuts, with 64 million on top of that by 2020. That's County Durham's people's money that they have taken from us.
Well,
and, you know, in terms of the heavy heart
thing, are you saying that people don't understand where those cuts are coming from, or that they're putting the blame in the wrong place? I mean, what's the logic of that?
Well, I was just going to take on your point about this heavy heart, you know, people saying about the heavy heart. I don't know, I feel like that might be a bit patronising. And I don't know why people, you know, with this long history of such pain against them inflicted by successive Conservative governments, why they would turn to them. I think it probably is a bit about a disassociation from the government with the cuts. So, you know, Boris Johnson pretending that he is not the establishment when he very, very much is. But I don't want to say like people are going out with a heavy heart. People make decisions about what they think will be best for them in their lives. And I think the Labour Party, whilst we have, you know, a massive amount of work went into what would transform communities, I don't think we've communicated that effectively enough. We've been through a year of a crisis, a year that Keir Starmer will never get back, where we have been far too timid with this government. This is a dangerous government, a government which wishes to restrict our civil liberties, which of course affects workers if they want to take industrial action or withdraw their labour or whatever. Where is the aggression against that kind of harm? Where is the aggression? Where is the pain, the hurt, the outpouring of grief at the 150,000 people who have died because of coronavirus and all of the incompetencies of the government in handling this crisis? I think this is a complex picture. What is definitely clear to me is that what we don't need is to try and be more like the Tories. We need to be more socialist, in my view, speak to the concerns of working class people, whether you're in Concert in County Durham or whether you're in, a London borough. The experience of working class people is a complex and scary one in 2021. And there's no time for timidity around that. There's no time for kind of, some of that kind of constructive narrative. We have to go at this government for what they are doing to our communities. And of course, regrettably, I think the leadership have also spent far too much time, as I said previously, attacking its base, attacking the activists, the people who are so loyal and were out there yesterday trying to return Labour councillors and a Labour MP.
So, Laura, Kirsty here in Edinburgh, just coming in on that, you don't want to be like the Tories, you need to be less like the Tories. Hi. Let's just talk about the possible cabinet reshuffle we're hearing about. You heard perhaps John McDonnell saying earlier, we need to return the party to being a broad church, which means presumably bringing the left in. I mean, would you be in favour of bringing back people like Richard Bergen, John McDonnell, Don Butler? Do you need to have a change of direction in the shadow cabinet?
We need, we need more socialists, not less. I want, I'm a socialist inside the Labour Party, and I think a swing to the right would be disastrous. We're never going to outright the Tories. The Tories are conservatives, and people need to understand that all of the economic decisions that have been made by this government are rooted in conservatism. We are opposed to that. I do not want to see, markets prioritised over the health of people. I want to see the NHS remain in public hands, not to be privatised. We have to be really confident about those principles. And of course, Laura, having more people in the shadow cabinet with those views would be very helpful.
Well, Laura, on that point, they came for Corbyn after 16 months. How long do you give Keir Starmer if he can't change the weather for Labour in terms of strategy?
What I'd rather focus on is just how we make sure that we are countering this government. I'm not one for kind of getting involved in all the drama of like when and where and, who's going to be next as leader. Should he stay, should he not? I don't want to get into that because I just care about taking on this government. I don't think people realise how worried, how much in pain people are at the moment in our communities, how scared they are about the poverty that they face coming out of the coronavirus crisis. All of the people with eviction notices sat there thinking, who's representing me? Who in Parliament is going to be my voice? That's what I care about, and the Labour Party need to do that. We need to be the voice of all of the people who are harmed so deeply by this government.
Laura, thank you so much. We're slightly up against the clock, sorry, but you made lots of points that we will pick up on and talk about, but thanks for joining us, OK?
Thanks to both of you, thanks.
And now let's look pan-Scotland. David Wallace Lockhart looks at the key seats to watch here in Scotland.
Let's have a look at some of the key constituencies in this Scottish election, starting with the most marginal seat, Dumbarton, found on the River Clyde in the west of Scotland. The seat's a mix of urban and rural, with hills and glens and lochs. It's also the site of the Faslane nuclear submarine base. Remember, it's SNP policy to get nuclear weapons out of Scotland. Scottish Labour's deputy leader, Jackie Baillie, has held the seat since devolution. But in recent years, the SNP has been gaining ground, and Jackie Baillie held her seat last time by just 109 votes. So it's a really hotly contested seat, and Tony Giuliano hopes to be the man to take it for the SNP as they seek that majority. Every vote counted here could carry huge implications. Let's head to the heart of Scotland's capital now, and the seat of Edinburgh Central. Famous for its festival, Edinburgh Castle and the Scottish Parliament itself. No matter who comes out on top, there will be a new MSP here, because Ruth Davidson, the former Scottish Conservative leader, is standing down. She'll be taking up a seat in the House of Lords. She ousted the SNP at the last election. Before that, it was a Labour stronghold. Ruth Davidson's majority in 2016 was thin, at just over 600 votes, and the SNP candidate is no newcomer. It's former leader of the party at Westminster, Angus Robertson. He'll take on Scott Douglas for the Tories. Brexit could be an issue here. The seat voted 69% to remain. Will voters here like the SNP policy of taking Scotland back into the EU? This is the sort of seat we'd expect the SNP to win if it's to achieve a majority. Let's head north to whisky country, to Murray. It's not just distilleries here. There's farming, forestry and fishing. And it's fishing in the wake of that Brexit deal that could be an important factor here. Many in the industry don't feel that deal ultimately reflected the future they were promised. The SNP's Richard Lockhead is looking to hold on to the seat. He's a Scottish Government minister. In 2016, it was Douglas Ross, now leader of the Scottish Conservatives, who made gains for the Tories here. He was then elected to Holyrood via the regional list before resigning when he went to Westminster in 2017. The Conservatives will have to perform well to win here, and the candidate tasked with that is former police officer Tim Eagle. Now, to East Lothian, just to the east of Edinburgh. It's been a Labour heartland ever since the first Scottish election in 1999. It's a big rural constituency, and its coast is dotted with famous golf courses. At the last election, Ian Gray won the seat. He's a former Labour leader in Scotland. He's standing down, so a new MSP will be coming. In 2016, the SNP came close to winning the seat. The Labour majority is just over 1,100 votes, and their candidate is Martin Whitfield, a former MP for the corresponding Westminster seat. So he's not an unknown face, and he looks to be in battle with the SNP's Paul McLennan. Talking of the MP for this area, the current one, Kenny McCaskill, has defected from the SNP to Alex Salmond's new Alapa party. Now, on paper, that's got nothing to do with this election, but could there be a backlash from SNP supporters angry that their Westminster representative has changed parties without facing a by-election? On a good day, this is the kind of seat Labour will hold on to, but the SNP could come through and take it where they missed out last time. Or can the Conservatives, who saw a big jump in their vote share in 2016, take advantage? Last but not least, let's have a look at Glasgow's south side. Unlike the others, this one isn't marginal, but still see two party leaders go head to head. Nicola Sturgeon of the SNP and Anna Sarwar of Scottish Labour are both running here. The seat was created in 2011 and Nicola Sturgeon has held it since. She's got a huge majority. Last time, Labour took a big hit here. Anna Sarwar is very unlikely to win. He's standing in his home constituency to try and make some progress in a city that was once a Labour heartland but is now firmly SNP. A welcome sign of progress for him would be eating into the SNP's dominance here. The Scottish Labour leader is also among his party's list candidates, so regardless of what happens in this seat, he should be returned to Holyrood through that route. So that's some of the key seats to watch, and any of them changing hands could have significant consequences.
Thanks very much, David. And David there was particularly early on talking about Dumbarton. Dumbarton, majority for Labour, just 109 votes. SNP are harrying them in Dumbarton. But Hope Webb in Clydebank is at the Dumbarton count. This is the first count that we can go to in Scotland. Good morning, Hope. What are we on course for here, roughly in terms of time, do we think? We're early afternoon?
Yeah, well, like you say, all eyes are on the Dumbarton constituency here, but it's not the first one that we will hear a declaration from. We're expecting a declaration for the Clydebank and Mulgai constituency just after noon, so an early declaration here. Now, the candidate is current SNP Gil Patterson, but he is stepping down in this election, so the SNP are hoping to replace him with Mary McNair. The second party last time around in 2016 was Labour, but it is expected to be an SNP hold. But all eyes are on Dumbarton, where, as you say, Jackie Baillie has held that seat since 1999, the year of the creation of the Scottish Parliament. But it is Scotland's most marginal seat. Last time around in 2016, she held on by just 109 votes. So it is an anticipated wait to see if she can cling on to that, or whether those progression the SNP has made in the last few years will be just enough to turn it yellow.
Well, we were hearing from Nick Early later, and we're just about to hear from him earlier, and we're just about to hear from him again, but he was saying that the issue, particularly in Dumbarton, might mean the consolidation of the unionist vote. And actually that might help Jackie Baillie if the consolidation of the unionist vote is around the Conservatives.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of local issues around here. Obviously, the Dumbarton constituency is home to Fastlane, the Royal Navy submarine service, and the nuclear deterrent. A big employer in this area, the SNP, are against the renewal of Trident, and Labour's Jackie Baillie has backed that. So will that play into her favour? And obviously, the Conservatives could make inroads here. Will this kind of be an indication as to what we might see for the picture across the country? We'll just have to wait to see, really, to what will happen.
Thanks very much indeed. I hope Nick Eardley joins me here in the studio. Dumbarton first.
It's going to be tight. I think it's going to be very tight. It might be as tight as last time. The talk on the ground in Dumbarton for the last few weeks is tactical voting is a big thing, and that would work in Jackie Baillie's favour. Postal votes seem to be high, so that would be people who are wedded to a party, who truly believe in what they're doing. But here's another thing. Turnout across the country seems to be up on 2016. Now, normally that would favour the SNP. Typically their vote is seen as the softest. If they get it out like they did in 2015, like they did in 2019, the general elections, they do very well. I think it's slightly more complicated this time though, because everybody's talking about the tactical unionist voting. When it comes to the first past the post element of this, the constituencies, that could be really crucial to whether the SNP get the extras they need to get a majority.
For example, in Edinburgh Central.
Edinburgh Central is a good example. I think the Tories are slightly less confident in the tactical voting there than they are perhaps in some other areas.
Well, let's just stick with the city because you've got news and postal votes in Edinburgh.
Seems to be huge. I mean, there's some talk of 80–90% of postal votes coming back. And remember that the number of people who applied for a postal vote for this election because of the pandemic is higher than it's ever been before. It's about a quarter of the electorate, 1 million people. And if in some parts of the country that's really high, then it suggests that, you know, a lot of people are thinking about what is going on there, thinking about the Constitution and thinking about who they want to take the country forward.
The Constitution has been front and centre at this election, despite the fact that Anna Sawar of Labour might push it on to recovery issues and poverty and so forth. But just very quickly on the results, because you're hearing that things are maybe happening faster than we thought they might.
Yeah, there's some talk that some of the results are going to come in a bit earlier than we were thinking. We thought it might be 5–6 o'clock before they started to roll in. We might be able to bring that slightly earlier. And look, there are some this afternoon that I think will give a decent indication of where things are going. Seats like Dumbarton, Edinburgh Central, East Lothian, Edinburgh Southern, we'll be able to tell if that tactical voting is happening or if the SNP are managing to get new voters and their extended base out, which gives them a fighting hope of getting that majority.
So, you know, by the late afternoon, early evening, we might be on target to show whether the SNP are picking up the seats they need to form an outright majority or not.
Yes, but it's complicated because if you win a constituency, it has a knock-on for the regional list. So I think we'll be able to tell later today how well the SNP are doing in picking up the constituencies. But I think we're in for the long haul. It's going to be tomorrow before we know if they're getting that majority.
With that, thank you, Nick, for now, and back to you, Huw.
It's interesting, Nick, talking there about turnout, because, again, it's a bit early to be judging this. We're going on early stage turnout. John Curtice, our resident expert, telling us earlier that in terms of the English local elections, there's no sign at all that the pandemic, with all the restrictions on canvassing and all the rest of it and campaigning, no indication that that has had an effect on turnout in the English local elections. Indeed, John was saying, if anything, they seem to be slightly up. Nick there saying that turnout in Scotland, certainly on some evidence, seems to be up. And just anecdotal evidence in Wales from some of my friends there saying, well, there were very long queues at polling stations in Wales in some areas last night at 10 o'clock. So they sensed, these are party workers telling me, they sensed that there was more determination to vote in quite a few of the areas where there's a lot of competition going on. And Vicky and I were discussing this earlier. And Vicky, this kind of opened up a whole conversation for us about what you might describe as a kind of feel-good factor. If there is a combination out there of, I've had my jabs, I feel quite good about that. It feeds maybe into the Brexit narrative. You know, look at the EU, they've had their problems, but whereas we are quite good with our vaccine rollout. Maybe now today, if they announce that, you know, more holidays are possible, that's another factor. Do you think that will emerge as actually if not one of the biggest, maybe the biggest factor in this set of elections.
Yeah, and it's certainly what Conservative MPs were reporting back to me as they were out on the doorsteps everywhere, that, yeah, it's been, of course, the most horrendous of years. And, you know, the death toll has been appalling. But people are looking back and they're actually maybe more forgiving. This is what Tory MPs were saying to me when they were speaking to voters. They're more forgiving about some of the mistakes that were made, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic, because they maybe recognise that whoever was in power, this was an unprecedented situation and there were going to be huge issues. Now, it's not to say that there weren't problems, but actually people have been desperate to move on. And actually in those kind of scenarios, you know, people want good news, don't they? Yeah. They want to know that maybe they can go on holiday. They want to know they can meet up again with relatives. They want the vaccine rollout to be successful. No matter who's in government, they want that to be working. Now, the question was, were the Conservatives in a place to gain the benefit of that? And again, certainly Conservative campaigners who are out and about did feel that they were reaping the rewards for some of that. And people were looking for positivity and were prepared to thank, in some cases, Boris Johnson for that, despite all the other things that were going on. And we've talked, you know, before, haven't we, about the coverage about allegations of sleaze, which Keir Starmer talked about a lot, and whether there was going to be cut through on all of that. Now, again, it's not to say people don't care at all about those things. Of course they do, but do they care enough for it to switch their vote away from Boris Johnson and the Conservatives? Now, it appears that in some places it hasn't been enough for that. They care about other things more. And that's what some of the criticism of Keir Starmer that's coming through from Labour MPs, that he was focusing and relying too much on that maybe, rather than coming up with his own policies and coming up with an alternative policy platform, which of course they also admit is difficult in a pandemic to criticise the government.
Indeed it is, and you can see that. And it's difficult too to campaign on anything that you might describe as a feel-good factor because of the pain that people have been through. That's absolutely clear as well. And yet we have these elements now that we can identify as being maybe areas of relief for people and maybe a bit of optimism about what's coming up ahead. What kind of message do you think Boris Johnson will be giving today?
I'm surprised it's taken him this long to come out and speak to us, to be honest, because it's a very positive night for him, and I think he will feel vindicated. You know, obviously you could see in the last Prime Minister's questions, you know, he looked rattled by the suggestion that he was up to no good, and that's what Keir Starmer was putting to him. And you could tell he was angry, he was annoyed about that, but he kept saying, people don't care. He kept saying that this was all a load of nonsense, that people actually care much more about jobs, about investment, about getting their vaccine. And he, I'm sure, will say that has been proven to be correct, as well as maybe people still in those areas like Hartlepool, having maybe been told by people like Keir Starmer after the referendum for 2 years, actually, you were wrong and you need to think again and have another referendum. That probably hasn't helped. No. And again, that's what a lot of Labour MPs are saying, is that, you know, they've got to try and move on from that Brexit argument. And the problem for Sir Keir Starmer is that a lot of people know him because he was the face of that campaign for a second referendum. And clearly people haven't forgotten that in some of those areas.
It's 25 to 12. What are your bets on when we'll hear something from the Prime Minister?
I think it's pretty imminent, I think, as soon as they can get that recording back to us. And, you know, I think he will be, of course, particularly pleased about Hartlepool, but not just that they've won it, but it's the manner in which they've run it, that it is a bigger majority than even Labour privately were expecting. And I think that will be positive for him, of course. And
equally, of course, expecting some reaction from Sir Keir Starmer as well as we go through the day. So with that, maybe Sir Keir's waiting for some more local election results to come in before he makes a judgment on what he wants to say. Reeta, what's the latest?
Well, these are the latest results that we have. There's a bit of a hiatus at the moment. Some of these came in early in the morning, some during the course of the morning. But Vicky was talking there about Brexit and how that is still a live issue. And this is what some of these results show, which is Conservative advances in Leave voting areas. So you can see on this board there are 4 Conservative gains, 2 Conservative holds, 2 Labour holds. The Conservative gains are all in Leave voting areas, and they've had some very, very positive results for them in Dudley, where they gained an MP in that area in 2019, in Harlow, in Nuneaton and in Northumberland. They've advanced a little bit less, but they've still gained that council. And the sobering news for Labour really is that even in a council like Sunderland, which they've held on to, their share of the vote has actually gone backwards. So some difficult results here for the Labour Party. We have had, do remember, of course, that, you know, there are so many contests going on this time round, a full 7 contests, and we've had one of the results in from one of the mayoral elections. There are 13 mayoral elections going on. Doncaster, now this is a hold for Labour here. The incumbent was Ros Jones, and she has been returned as the mayor of Doncaster. It went to a second round, so you remember that the system for electing a mayor is one of voters get 2 votes. If nobody gets 50% of the vote, then the top 2 have a runoff, and the second preferences of all the others are then distributed between the 2. So it went to a second round, and Ros Jones got it on 60% of the vote. So that is our very first result in from the mayoral elections.
Reeta, thanks very much. We're joined now by a resident knight, Sir John Curtice. John, first of all, I mean, how much worse is this for Keir Starmer than for Jeremy Corbyn?
Well, if we remind ourselves that this, of course, is Sir Keir Starmer's first set of local elections, and remind ourselves also that the 2017 local elections were Jeremy Corbyn's first set of local elections, then it's pretty clear that Labour are doing less well than they did in those elections, and that's why we're seeing all of these gains. Now, on the other hand, of course, we've got 2 sets of elections, so we can also compare also with the position in 2017 in the places where the seats were last contested in 2017. Now, at the moment, I would say certainly Sir Keir Starmer is not doing any worse than Jeremy Corbyn did in 2017, though whether he's going to end up doing somewhat better, we will need more information on. But certainly, I mean, where we are at the moment and all the evidence we've got, we are probably going to be somewhere not a million miles away from where the opinion polls suggested we were. So the opinion polls have been saying that there's a Conservative lead over Labour. Therefore, given that back in 2016 there really wasn't much of a Conservative lead over Labour, we should expect the Conservatives to be making gains in places which were last fought over in 2016. On the other hand, the polls have also been saying that the Conservative lead over Labour is probably somewhat less than the lead that the Conservatives enjoyed over Labour at the time of 2017, and that therefore probably Labour might make some gains in those kinds of areas. And for the most part, that's roughly where we're at. And I think therefore also, I mean, one kind of caution on what I've heard, well, two words of caution. One is that probably, if what I've just said is right, the Conservative lead over Labour is now probably less than it was at the 2019 general election. And secondly, I think it's far too early to come to a judgment as to whether or not the Labour's attacks on the cost of the wallpaper in 12 Downing Street to 11 Downing Street made any difference or not. Because we know from the polls, well, if the polls are right, it made a bit of a difference, but it didn't make that much of a difference. And we don't frankly know whether or not we are looking at something, what the polls were saying before all that row blew up or not. So I would be cautioned so far about saying that the Labour Party's attack on the cost of the wallpaper didn't make any difference.
However, let's just hone in for a minute on Hartlepool, and we heard early on about the psychological damage of losing Hartlepool to the extent that they did, with a 16% swing away. That is nothing short of catastrophic for Keir Starmer.
But there's a very clear pattern going on here. So apart from the fact that it depends on which year we are comparing things with, 2016 or 2017, the other crucial thing is whether or not we're looking at a Remain area or a Leave area. Now, Hartlepool, of course, is a really strong Leave area, and the result of the by-election typifies a pattern that is there in the local election results we've got in so far. And of course, it is still relatively early days, but it's perfectly clear that the Conservatives are gaining ground primarily in Leave voting areas and Labour is doing rather better in Remain voting areas. And indeed, I think we'll probably find by the end of this afternoon that in Remain voting areas, where the election last time was held in 2017, we will probably see the Labour Party making net gains. Now, of course, the issue is that as far as the Labour Party is concerned, this is not what they're trying to achieve. They're not trying to consolidate their position in Remain voting areas. They wish to regain their former strength in Leave voting areas. But therein lies the problem, which is that the Labour Party wishes to acquire the electorate that Boris Johnson has, and it seems to be keener on trying to achieve that objective than it is on trying to consolidate the support that it does have, which is amongst a very different electorate, younger people, graduates, people living in London, etc. And that, in a sense, is Labour's strategic dilemma. Does it run with the electorate that it's got, or does it run with the electorate that it would prefer to have?
John, thanks very much indeed. And I'm joined now in Edinburgh by Andrew Wilson, former SNP MSP and the author of the Sustainable Growth Commission for Scotland in 2019. First of all, Andrew Wilson, let's just pick up on the whole idea that it was a tactic by the Tories to go hard on the Constitution, to go hard on Scottish independence in the campaign. And if the Unionist vote coalesces round the Conservatives and completely bleeds away from Labour, that is a problem in terms of extending the majority for the SNP.
Yeah, well, we'll see what happens. There's no doubt the Conservatives campaigned against what they're not for, rather than for anything, and no one other than Nicola Sturgeon was running to be First Minister.
Yeah, but
so
as a tactician, you would have done the same thing.
I'm not sure. I think if I was the Conservatives, I'd like to try and build ourselves as an alternative government, but that they are not. But yes, the election was largely about this question of choice. And it's amazing, really, when you think about it. What is the route for Scotland to choose democratically whether or not we self-determine? I think that every Prime Minister since I was born has accepted. Is there now no democratic route? Is the Union about legal force, or is it about consent?
Now, the impact of the SNP doing well in the constituencies may well be, of course, that the Greens are going to be doing a lot better on the list. Now, we know that the Green vote, of course, we say the Green vote is a vote for independence, but the Green vote primarily is a vote for environmental change. Is there a qualitative difference in terms of the pressure for an independence referendum if the SNP are short of a majority and is essentially are helped by the Greens, or whether Nicola Sturgeon believes that as a leader she wants to have an outright majority? You see the qualitative difference, that not all Greens are independents.
Well,
not all SNP voters are independent.
Yeah, I mean, that's the nature of manifestos. This time the Greens made clear in their manifesto they were pro-referendum, which is really the big issue, is are you pro-choice or not in terms of getting the chance to vote on it. Obviously, if the SNP win an overall majority today and tomorrow, this will be remarkable because it will be a fourth-term government. And it's a proportional representation system. I can't think of a country on earth.
It was designed not to have a majority. It would also mean that the SNP would be in power until 2026, and there's some really big questions that haven't been answered on things like 24% of kids in poverty. Overall attainment might be slightly up, but appalling differences between the different councils in Scotland. Those kind of things will not be under the cloak of arguments with the Constitution, because if you go ahead for a referendum, those questions would really be very closely asked, and a lot of scrutiny brought to bear on the SNP's record on that.
Yeah, well, rightly, every government should be held to account for what they're delivering. The case around the Constitution in Scotland is dominated by the fact that the economic powers of the Parliament here are not sufficient to tackle the great harms and inequalities that we face, not just here but around the world.
So just briefly, because we'll be returning to this, the question, and it's been raised by a former civil servant who drew up the 2012 agreement that led to the independence referendum in the first place, that you can govern in Scotland by consent of the people. But if the consent of the people is not there, Boris Johnson will govern by force of the law. Mm-hmm. Is that right?
Well, I think it's an appalling indictment, really, isn't it? I mean, Kieran Martin's lecture at Blavatnik was a seismic moment, I think, for the British government, because they should listen to what he says. We can't hold a union together against the will of its constituent parts. We ought to be about democracy rather than legal force. That's not the country Britain is.
Thank you very much indeed, Andrew Wilson.
Well, just as the sirens are blasting there, let's get right up to date with our scoreboard, if you like, of councillors in the local authorities across England. It's still early days because we've got 143 local authorities to declare, 4,500 councillors. But so far, in terms of councillors, Conservatives are up 60, Labour down 63, Lib Dems up 2, the Greens up 3 and the others down 2. So the trend of that is pretty clear so far. Some powerful gains for the Conservatives and some rather disappointing losses for Labour. So with that in mind, and given that we were talking earlier about the by-election in Hartlepool, I'm pleased to say that the former Labour MP for Hartlepool, Lord Mandelson, Peter Mandelson, has joined us. Of course, former Cabinet Minister, former European Commissioner, and a distinguished strategist. Peter, thanks for coming in.
Nice to be here.
Must be very sad for you to see what happened in Hartlepool from Labour's point of view.
It is. I'm very upset. I care very deeply about the town, and I've spent a great deal of time there during the by-election campaign all this week, going from door to door. But although it was a funny old by-election, a strange campaign, two things are absolutely clear to me about it. One is that COVID, the pandemic, almost literally drained the politics out of the by-election and out of the campaign. It was almost impossible to raise any issue, to touch on any subject, to issue any challenge on anything other than what people really wanted to talk about, which was COVID, the pandemic, getting through it, and of course the vaccine, which has offered a huge reprieve for the government. And usually by-elections are occasions where people issue a powerful message or a big protest vote against whatever they think the government is doing wrong. This didn't happen in this by-election. Secondly, it's perfectly clear to me that the Labour Party has basically not been forgiven for losing its way during the last decade. When we came out of government in 2010, the people who took over the leadership of the Labour Party, thought it was incredibly clever to sort of try and airbrush out and then sort of extinguish all the achievements that we had chalked up in government. Things which my constituents in Hartlepool and elsewhere in the country had enthusiastically voted for, giving us 3 successive major victories. And yet here was the Labour Party trying to distance itself from the achievements of its own government. And then we sort of accelerated headlong into the sort of fantasy land of Jeremy Corbyn. And it is amazing, because Jeremy Corbyn has not been leader of the Labour Party for, a year. And yet here I was in Hartlepool, having his name, being bandied around on the doorstep, thrown at me. He casts a long shadow still over the Labour Party. And until we have made it absolutely irrevocably clear that we have changed, that we have moved on, that we are not that sort of Labour Party anymore, I'm not sure whether those absolutely respectable working class voters who were our bedrock for New Labour are going to forgive us and are going to come back to us.
It was interesting earlier, Peter, just talking about the debate, the internal debate in the party, which has obviously reignited today following the result, and we spoke to...
You call it a debate, yeah?
Well, it's an exchange of views.
It's
an exchange of views. And a former Labour MP, former colleague of yours, Laura Pidcock, in County Durham, was saying exactly the opposite, which was that the party's message simply wasn't radical enough. It simply wasn't appealing to the working classes. It wasn't a programme that they would be attracted to.
Why did she lose her seat then herself in 2019? She stood on a programme of radical policies, all the things that she believes in and wanted to put forward, and she lost in Durham. Why? If it was so good, if it was so brilliant, if it was so appealing, why did she lose?
I'm making the point, Peter, that this debate is
I'm
still going on.
Rhetorically.
I mean, this debate is still going on. John McDonnell earlier making the same point.
Yeah.
But it's a point about perceptions. It's a point about perceptions.
That this party cannot learn from its defeats. It can't even learn from its victories. It can't even learn from its victories. We had 4 successive election defeats before Blair was elected in 1997. And then he won again. And then he won again after that. And since then, we've had another 4 election defeats. It's about time we learned both from our defeats and from our victories.
OK, where Sir Keir's concerned and the way that he's being advised, and you will have an important role in that, as will others. On the question of Brexit, which many people feel the party has misjudged, and that Sir Keir hasn't been clear enough about the party's acceptance of it. Has that been a weakness?
Absolutely not an issue raised with me once by a single voter on any doorstep during this entire campaign. Now, however, let me make the point, because I think people feel Brexit's done. It's delivered. And by the way, an awful lot of Brexit Party voters gave their support to the Conservatives in order to reward Boris Johnson for delivering them their Brexit. And they're entitled to do that, and I completely understand it. But where I think that Brexit is a factor is in this respect. Brexit values the sorts of cultural differences, social differences, the sort of intensity of feeling that it excited, that is still present. It's not about Europe. It's not about self-government. It's not about, relitigating the Brexit decision. But there are now clearly cultural and social divisions which, in a sense, were exposed by Brexit, which do overlay economic and other class interests amongst people in the north of England, and they were very clearly on display in talking to me in my former constituency. So this is something Labour has to understand. The truth is that there has grown over the last decade again. I make no apology for admitting this. Over the last decade, quite a deep cultural disconnect has grown between the Labour Party, first under Ed Miliband and then under Jeremy Corbyn. Between our party and those voters who socially and culturally are not on the same wavelength as us and not on the same page, even though they like many of our policies. They feel that we are trying to stand up for them. We bring the investment in public services. We're trying to bring jobs to areas which have lost industry. We're trying to bring change. But there's something else which is not so economic, which is not about class. It's about social and cultural differences. And the Labour Party has got to understand that and come to terms with that if we are ever going to succeed in getting back onto that wavelength of those bedrock voters in Hartlepool and elsewhere who clearly we've lost.
Peter, bear with us because there we can see in our big screen, Kirsty's in Edinburgh. She wanted to come in with a question.
Peter, talking about those bedrock voters, 53% of those bedrock voters voted for Labour in Hartlepool in 2017. Today in Hartlepool, we hear, older working class voters who own their homes, maybe even 2 cars, that actually Labour has no song to sing to them. There is nothing to say to them. They believe that the levelling up agenda is going to help them, their children and their grandchildren.
Well, Kirsty, you make a very, very important point, because what I did hear on the doorstep time and again is if we've got a Tory government, we might as well get a Tory MP who can get money into Hartlepool through the Tory Tees Valley mayor. Now, in a sense, this almost was a sort of transaction that voters were entering into. It wasn't that they weren't ever going to vote Labour again, but for now, they were looking at this, frankly, in an almost instrumental way. People said to me, money's gone all over the place. It's gone anywhere but in Hartlepool. And the reason is that Tory Tees Valley mayor has not sent the money our way. If we get a Tory MP, they can't say no to us again. Well, I mean, you can call it a bribe if you like, you can call it pork barrel politics, but actually it's straight basic politics. And I do not criticise my former constituents for voting in that way, because frankly, Hartlepool has taken a real toll in the last 10 years from Tory austerity and public service cuts and spending cuts in the town. And if they feel that they can get a little bit more of it now to offset that, who can blame them for doing so?
Yes, and your former colleague Laura Kuenssberg was talking about cuts to local authority services, and then that shift of money, as you say maybe pork barrel politics or whatever. But they see local mayors, they see people at Ben Houchin in their own image, doing things that would be unthinkable from a former Tory government, privatising the local airport. Whoever would have done that? And yet he's been given the freedom to do that. So they see localism affecting them in a way that actually Labour hasn't been able to deliver that for them, even in terms of the message.
But Kirsty, the reason we haven't been able to deliver it is because we haven't been in office, we haven't been in power for 10 years. We've lost 4 successive general elections since we came out of office in 2010. Ask yourself why. Why is that the case? Ask the leaders who changed the Labour Party so radically after 2010 and then did so again with Jeremy Corbyn. Ask them why they think we have lost 4 successive general elections. And then ask yourselves why we haven't been in a position to help people like those in my former constituency who have done without and who have paid the price for Labour failure.
Peter, it's very good of you to come in, and thank you for sharing your analysis with us, and we're grateful. Thank you very much indeed. Lord Mandelson there, the former Labour Cabinet Minister. Thanks to him for coming in.
Well, that's all from us now on BBC Two. If you're watching in Scotland or indeed in Wales, there's coverage about to begin on BBC One.
Or, of course, you can stay with us for these crucial results on the BBC News channel, wherever you are in the UK, until 10 o'clock tonight, believe it or not. So let's hope you stay with us.